Chapter 21 Surviving the Wilderness, Part 1. Normally, the first step should have been to gather information, but Northern was not about to question a sea of dead monsters. Irritated, he slowly moved around, having to step into the puddles of darkened blood, which was an unpleasant feeling. The disgust he felt made his heart squirm. He might have been acting tough all the while, but he was as timid as any other kid would be. The only difference with Northern was that he wasn't a child, and so he handled that timidity with an expected level of maturity. Compared to others, he was a mature individual. Speaking of others, I wonder what happened to them. The teleportation circle should have transported all of them together to the same place, or so Northern thought. But finding himself here like this, he didn't even know what to think anymore. Doesn't that mean the former principal is overpowered? Magic was a sensitive subject, vastly different from what Northern had learned about in fictional comics and isekai anime. Difficult to comprehend and highly technical to use, its origin traced back to the founder who had awakened a seemingly combat-useless talent. In the beginning, he was scorned and despised because of his useless talent. All his talent could do was light up a small ball of fire. The farthest the ball of fire could go was 2 meters, and its impact could not even be compared to a flicker of flame. However, he found a grimoire called Himab-Tahab, Diary of the Spell Weaver. This book brought a transformative change to the Academy founder's life. His talent never grew, but his arsenal of skills continued to expand. He became strong enough to walk in and out of catastrophic rifts. His talents eventually grew, and he became the one who created tiers for rifts and classified them. Armed with the Himab-Tahab, he became a weaver himself, perhaps not as mighty as the spell weaver who was never a native of Ul'Tra-el, but he was the founder of spell art, a unique form of spell weaving that involved speaking words. The grimoire was passed down to his students and their successors until Ruffsberg's time. Hence, Ruffsberg was undoubtedly one of the strongest humans in Ul'Tra-el. Being able to create a teleportation spell that sends people to diverse locations further proved how dangerous and powerful he is. But this was still no good in any way. Northern paused and exhaled deeply, looking around him. As far as the eye could see to the distant horizon, the ominous crimson sky melted into the gory earth, littered with the broken corpses of monstrosities bathing in a red sea of blood. Blood pooled around severed limbs scattered haphazardly among the countless mangled bodies, seeping into the muddy ground. Splintered bones and ruptured organs oozed pus, painting this barren wasteland with a macabre mosaic of carnage. It was a gruesome and disturbing sight. The white-haired boy slowly traversed this macabre mosaic of carnage, treading carefully. Catching a faint glimmer amongst the monster's remains, Northern paused, a slight frown creasing his brow. Reaching towards the bottomless bag slung across his shoulders, his hand brought out a small knife. Thank goodness Father gave me this. Northern bent down and began to part the viscera of the dead monster. Most of its bones were shattered, the ones left were cracked, and as Northern's blade drove through, the brittle links broke with little effort. He wondered what monster would have inflicted this level of damage. He wasn't familiar with the ranks of monsters, but something on the level of the black beast his father fought would have been able to do this. Even so, he wasn't too sure. After he was done, Northern found 2 cores sitting in front of him. He took the cores and dropped them into the bag, feeling the weight change slightly. Then an idea occurred to him. This was definitely a battle between monsters. If so, could it be possible that all the monster cores were still left? Wait, but monsters also feed on each other's cores. Northern shrugged. If it was a war between monsters, no monster would have had the time to harvest each other's cores. It could have been done after the bloody battle, but it's very possible that they could have missed a few. Northern grinned. This is a blessing. He brandished his small knife with an avaricious look on his pale face. Hours later, Northern had only been able to find 6 cores, 2 from another monster and 2 from 2 other monsters. After which he decided he would just keep walking and check anyone he came across. It was quite pitiful that he couldn't absorb soul energies from soul cores, but he was sure they would be plenty of use for them. At Nobleman at. Now, he just had to find someone, whatever way. And so Northern began walking, and walking. 2 more hours later, he was still trudging across the bloodscape, having to carefully part his way amidst the carcasses of chitinous monsters. Finally, he reached a cave but stopped. Another Northern appeared next to him, nodded, and jogged into the cave. A few minutes later, it came out and made an "okay" sign to Northern, exactly what Northern would have done if he was asked to scout. Even before the clone came back with a result, Northern already knew what was in the cave. Gripping the strap of his bag tightly, Northern tentatively made his way into the cave. It was dark, but not hard to see. yet far in the encroaching darkness of the cave, there was a dancing twinkle of flames. It was an abandoned fireplace that seemed to have been recently made. Northern's guess, immediately upon receiving the information from his clone's experience, was that someone had recently been here. Perhaps they were teleported before him. He doubted if that was possible, but he also remembered it happening once. Also, Northern didn't think it was possible for anything capable of lighting a fire to exist inside a rift. He hurried towards the fireplace, and as expected, it was empty. Northern sat next to it and removed a few meats he had cut. He wasn't hungry, but there was no bad idea in skewering them for the future. Staying around the fire was strangely comforting, even though he was surrounded by a crepuscular darkness. A couple of minutes later, he stared intently at the meat as the flames roasted it inside out, occasionally turning it around. He had first cut all the monster meat in his possession into small pieces and began to skewer them piece by piece. While thinking about a lot of things, there was much on his mind. What was going to happen from here? Would he die? Would he live? Would the Academy do something to rescue them? As he thought of these questions, fear slowly crept into his heart. It was a familiar fear that everyone could relate to, finding yourself in a dimension filled with orders of feral evil. Every corner one turns could be lurking with extremely dangerous monsters. And death could call his name any moment. He had absolutely no idea what tomorrow, no, even the next hour held. Northern could get attacked the next second, in fact. As if waiting to prove his thoughts right, a low growl eerily crept out of the darkness, making his ears rise with blood-curdling fear. Chapter 22 Surviving the Wilderness Part 2. Northern gripped the knife tightly in his hands, retreating as he waited for the creature to enter the area illuminated by the fire. Slowly, a white-furred creature with savage blue eyes crept out of the darkness, snarling and gnashing its white fangs. Its legs trembled, but the creature did not cease its snarling, trying to intimidate him. Instead of being scared, what Northern saw was a creature that had survived against the odds. Perhaps it had been hidden here by its mother, who may have lost her life to the war raging outside. As a drifter, or one aspiring to become a drifter, he was expected to kill all rift creatures. Undoubtedly, there were creatures that could be tamed, but it depended on one's talent. Trying to tame a creature without the appropriate talent was essentially suicidal. Even if it was a cub, one day it would grow, and there was no telling what might happen. Hence, the rules compelled Northern to eliminate this creature. He clenched his fist tightly around the knife. A cub shouldn't be too difficult. The pitiful youngling's fur was marred, blood stains splattered across different areas. Its eyes held a fading light, but the ferocity on its face showed what a valiant fighter it was. Seeing it put on a brave front despite the situation left a bitter taste in Northern's mouth. He couldn't bring himself to kill the poor thing. Northern withdrew his knife and tucked it into his bag, then raised his hand. The pup shrank back in fear as Northern raised his hand. However, it stood its ground and glared at him tentatively. Both of them had something in common: white hair and blue eyes. I wonder if it's fate or mere coincidence. After all, he had encountered creatures that seemed to control the strings of fate before reincarnating into this world. Even if he wasn't a believer in such things as fate or destiny, Northern was open to every possibility in this world. Besides, there was no way something wasn't at play here. Rifts, monsters, maybe they were just as affected as the humans and left with no choice but to fight for their survival. I'm not about to understand the perspective of a monster, but at least I can help and protect you until you can do so on your own. In the future, you'll owe me one. Northern said to the pup, unsure if it could comprehend him or not. The pup stared blankly at him, tilting its head slightly. Northern sighed and reached into his bag. At that moment, the furry pup snarled angrily. The next second, all the folds on its muzzle disappeared, its nose began sniffing the air, and carefully, the creature moved closer to Northern. Northern tossed the meat on the ground and watched the pup pick it up with extreme caution. It must have been betrayed before to be so wary. The little thing tentatively took a first bite, its eyes still fixed on the white-haired boy. Seeing that the creature would not eat well with him around, Northern finally turned away. Immediately, the monster gobbled up the meat as fast as it could. When Northern turned back, it was done and snarling at him again. What an ungrateful thing. At the very least, I gave you food, so I don't expect you to attack me. Northern returned to the fireplace casually and observed the wary pup for a while. It resembled a wolf from Earth, except that it had more fur and no tail. Every other part was wolf-like. The creature stared at him cautiously and didn't move from its spot. Both of them spent the next few hours wary of each other. At some point, it began to doze but refused to fully sleep until it saw the human lay on the floor without concern and fall asleep. Only then did it also succumb to slumber. Northern woke up the next day, shocked to find the cub fast asleep, for once looking peaceful and at rest. Deciding not to disturb its slumber, Northern tiptoed outside to examine the skies. He paused as he reached the cave's entrance, a slight frown marring his features. "What is this?" he murmured under his breath. He was certain the sleep he had enjoyed lasted at least 4 hours. If he calculated based on how long he had been here, it should have been at least 8 hours. Although it wasn't a calculation he could boast of being accurate, it should be more or less correct. By now, the sun or daylight star, whatever it was in this region, should at least be preparing to climb the sky. However, what greeted his vision was the same ashen darkness. At Nobleman at. Rifts were an embodiment of strange worlds, a part of a dimension torn from its original and linked to TRAL. When another rift appeared, it was a piece of another dimension severed and connected to TRAL. So yes, they could be diverse in weather conditions and conceptual laws. There was no particular thing to expect, and anything could be possible. But it wasn't like Northern knew this. He had just been thrust into this place with no knowledge whatsoever, hence his assumption that there should be daylight. It only made sense that there should be one. But if there wasn't, there was nothing to do about it. He just had to keep moving forward. Northern stared at the grotesque landscape. The sea of crimson gore prompted him to imagine what sort of horror would have occurred to cause a scene like this. It was sickening to contemplate. There must have been at least hundreds of thousands of monsters clashing against each other. From what Northern could tell of the corpses, one part was a chitinous creature with powerful bone scythes for hands. The other was a bestial creature with muscular limbs and a head resembling that of an ox. Its hairless hide revealed sinewy flesh that undoubtedly would have rippled with each movement. Its lipless muzzle curled back to expose rows of jagged, dagger-like teeth jutting upwards. Beady eyes like dark caverns glared from sunken sockets, devoid of any trace of reason or emotion besides primal bloodlust. Or maybe it was because this particular one was dead. Northern felt his entire body tremble with chills. A few seconds later, he shook away the feeling and looked towards the south, a straight line from where he had been coming. Northern squinted his eyes, staring absent-mindedly for a few seconds. He could start moving forward or stay back in the cave and wait for whoever set the fire to come around and rescue him. He was torn between those two decisions. While the latter seemed peaceful and safe, Northern did not feel good about lying around to be rescued. And what if what was coming for him was not a rescuer but his demise? So he decided he was going to take the risk and continue his journey forward. It was dangerous and scary, but he didn't have a choice. The least he could do was be cautious. He divided himself into 2 copies. For now, the number of clones he could manage was just 1, hopefully that would change as he started hunting monsters. I wish I had copied a better clone and not Shin's. But who knew something like this would happen? After examining his father's talent, he understood how talents worked. When a drifter gained a dimensional name, the name was tied to the talent they awakened. Because of the name, they received certain attributes, which were more like passive abilities that shaped the personality of their talents and its passive effects, either in relation to them or the environment. Then talents themselves had abilities. While talents were the core, their abilities were capable of growing endlessly. Of course, a large part of that depended on the class of talent. For example, an F-class talent was not capable of much growth and would only be equipped with 1 talent ability. In terms of what one could do with such talents, they would be very limited. However, that did not mean their growth would stop there. A drifter's soul rank increased in proportion to the effort put into closing down rifts or the number of monsters killed. Basically, the more soul essence one absorbed, the more their soul core was filled and finally upgraded, taking them to the next rank. Upon reaching the next rank, usually a new talent ability was unlocked. But for F-class talents, which were the lowest, they were limited to only 1 ability. Another perk that came with ranking up was that the body itself was reinforced. If a drifter with an F-class talent was an unparalleled martial artist, they would be strong, even compared to a drifter with a C-class talent at best. There was also the effect of one's attributes. Attributes were like invisible strings of fate. Chapter 23 Surviving the Wilderness, Part 3. Northern sighed and looked at the cave once more, torn in between taking the pup and just letting it continue to on its own. Which would most likely result in its death. But if he took the poor thing and decided to care for it, which he was in no capacity to, by the way. Peradventure he pulls it off somehow. What happens when it becomes a crude white ferality? At Nobleman at. Who even knows what it had become? Northern reconsidered his choice and shook his head at the thought of rescuing the pup. One good is enough. He was not about to outdo himself. He held onto the strap of his bag and turned to the front. He was about to take a step when he heard a little whimpering cry from below. Northern looked down. There it was. The little pup had managed to muster the courage to step out of the cave. Arg. Northern let out a tired breath, then turned away, saying to the monster, "Don't follow me, pal. You are on your own from now on." However, the monster decided to do the exact opposite of what it's been asked not to do. Northern's eyes remained at the front. Not once did he turn back until after traversing a certain distance. It has small legs, so there should be no way it would follow me closely to this point, Northern thought as he turned around. To his surprise, the little mutt was right behind him, speared in dried blood of the corpses it walked amidst. The furs of its paws were soaked black by blood. Northern paled his face, exhausted. Seriously, how are you even able to make it this far? The mutt raised innocent blue eyes at him with lonely chill that pierced his heart. Northern felt pity for it, but he really was in no position to have a pet. He looked to his front but stopped again and turned to the mutt. "I'll help you to a safe place and that'll be it," he uttered and picked up the monster, continuing forward with it in his arms. With Northern's clone in front, and him directly receiving the mental details of whatever was going on in front, Northern confidently trekked forward. Leaving footsteps in the murky floor of blood, Northern continued forward with the pup in his hands. Sometimes they would rest at little stone elevations that have managed to emerge victorious from the weathering effect of seasons and now stood a level above the ground as a sign. Although they were no better, smeared with blood of crude abominations. Other times, Northern would try find cores, and also taught the mutt to do the same. To save himself the stress of having to whistle to call it, Northern decided to name it Mr. Fluffy and made sure to check if it was male or female before adding the Mr. Mr. Fluffy was a fast learner and turned out he kind of understood Northern. He didn't understand the language Northern spoke, but with the hand gestures and his amazing intelligence, he got the idea of it. And acted accordingly after 2 failed trials. The first time it brought Northern a broken arm, the second time it was a spilled intestine. The second time Northern puked. Then he used the recent soul core he got to demonstrate to him. After that, Mr. Fluffy became very useful at spotting soul cores, raising the number of Northern's soul core loot to 16. The corpses of monsters were tremendously reducing at this point, which made Northern certain that he was progressing forward. The area of effect of the battlefield was reducing and hopefully he meets someone very soon. But there was a weird feeling within him, a subtle fear that everything was going his way. The farthest his clone could go from him was 100 meters. The moment their distance began to exceed 100 meters, Northern stopped receiving information details to his brain. The manifestation of the clone was fueled by soul essence, the form of energy that saturates the soul core. Although for an half-awakened drifter it was hard for them to accurately pinpoint their essence flow, the rules applied more or less. So if the clone should stay too far away from him for a long while, it will cease to exist. Northern closed his eyes for a moment, receiving the details of the clone. It was just like being there for a moment himself. However, since his brain could break down from such task, he needed to carefully do it without distractions. The good side was that it was brief. Northern picked the recent soul core and stood. His fell on the little mutt and drove back to the core in his hands. Then he dropped it on the ground. "I don't know how this works for monsters, but that's your share. You should be able to get stronger a little bit, that right?" Mr. Fluffy raised its head, puzzled, and shifted down to the core. Then opened its mouth wide before Northern could stop it, munched on the white orb. A part of its crunched into the mouth of the mutt. Even though it had a fragile teeth, they were enough to eat the whole core and yawn mouth wide. Northern helplessly shook his head, amazed by the monster's way of absorbing a soul core. I wonder if this is how all monsters absorb soul cores. For a second, he was tempted to give all his soul cores to Mr. Fluffy, but he killed the idea immediately it was birthed. As far as anything goes, soul cores and crystals were the most important materials in rifts. He was not about to feed something like that to a mutt he just met a few hours ago. That's called getting emotionally attached. Come what may, neither humans nor cute fluffy monsters would make him compromise his beliefs. Northern continued to walk forward. As time passed them, the floor was ridden of corpses. It was bare with reddish-brown sand that kicked into the air with every step he took. His walk was slowed and strained because of it. But it was relieving to know that there was no danger in front. Suddenly Mr. Fluffy's ear shot up. He became alerted and started to growl lowly. Without warning, the air turned blisteringly hot and oppressive around Northern. Before he could react, a hulking form hurtled toward him from behind, slamming its jagged, ebony talons into his unprotected side. Chapter 24 Night Terror. As the grotesque horror charged, Northern nimbly sidestepped the attack, hissing through gritted teeth as searing pain lanced across his nerves. The monster's razored talons had grazed his skin. He possessed no formal martial arts training whatsoever. Though he had insisted, his father steadfastly refused to teach the family's battle style, for reasons he never divulged. Son, one day you will enter a rift and discover an even better martial art that will become your own heirloom. Teaching you mine would be a great disservice, his father had said, his words heavy, expression stern whenever the matter arose. So Northern abandoned the idea. Like spell arts, martial arts were not easily mastered. Most extraordinary fighting disciplines originated as ways, intrinsic cultural practices known to the natives of other dimensions. Much remained shrouded in mystery, but clearly, some fallen civilizations had succumbed to the ravenous rifts and their monstrous denizens, their realms contorted into new horrific domains. The prevailing theory suggested that should Ul'Tra-el ever be conquered, it too could be ripped asunder into dimensional space, unleashing a fresh rift incursion upon the next world. Though unverified, it offered a plausible explanation. Notably, those peoples consumed by the rifts lacked the metaphysical concept of Ul embraced by Ul'Tra-elians. However, the quintessence of their martial arts, spell arts, and ways remained extraordinarily potent, elevating a drifter's strength exponentially. Prestigious nobles and royal families closely guarded their unique battle disciplines, their mastery serving as some badge of pride and status. Nearly every household, regardless of rank, boasted some form of inherited art, inferior or advanced. Even a lowly baron took pride in his humble techniques, heirlooms of ancestors who had drifted through realms and returned with hard-won trophies. Yet certain formidable clans stood apart, their extraordinary prowess bordering on the mythic. The Kageyama, with their signature raven emblems and blood-red eyes, were universally dreaded masters of death. Their vast power cowed even monarchs, as this vengeful spirit clan drifted between lands, their authority rivaling nations. Wherever the raven banner flew, dread and reverence filled hearts, for none could defy them without courting oblivion. The clan's patriarch sat among humanity's elite, a grand master, of which precious few existed across all realms. Attaining the evanescent soul rank granted the honorific reserved for the pinnacle of human potential. Rumor persisted of a mythical soul who had purportedly ascended even beyond evanescent to the fabled radiant rank, as foretold by Ul herself, but this remained unsubstantiated legend over the millennia. For all intents and purposes, the evanescent Grand Masters reigned supreme as mortal conquerors of the greatest attainable heights, a lofty caste which included the redoubtable Ruffsburg himself. Northern backpedaled, his heart thundering as he gaped at the eldritch abomination looming over him with primal malevolence. Four hollow crimson eyes locked onto him with predatory focus, gleaming with sadistic intent. He had never witnessed, nor even conceived, of such a nightmarish terror in his darkest dreams. If the calamity beast he'd faced alongside his father could be called presentable, this thing was a twisted mockery of nature itself. The malicious aura suffusing the cavern chilled Northern to his marrow, the icy tendrils of dread far more paralyzing than when he'd confronted the calamity beast. Back then, at least, he hadn't quaked with bone-deep terror. Every leaden muscle fiber told him this monster eclipsed that prior threat exponentially. I'm never going to survive this. He assessed the situation with brutal honesty. Having witnessed the harrowing difficulty of three of his father battling, and only narrowly defeating a calamity beast through sheer luck, how could a barely awakened drifter lacking both martial skill and a soul core possibly prevail against something so exponentially more daunting? Death loomed, inescapable, its shadow already encroaching. Northern's clammy fingers tightened around the paltry skinning knife, his mind whirling with panic and desperation. At nobleman at. Outmatched, his meager blade may as well have been a toothpick against this colossal abomination. But he couldn't resign himself, couldn't surrender. Without a fight, couldn't relinquish his stubborn grasp on this existence. Reason warred with a primal, blazing spark of defiance searing his soul. The reality of his hopeless situation raged against that irrational, unextinguishable will to fight, to struggle desperately until his dying breath, regardless of the odds. Though this wretched path had led him through his own darkest valley battling cancer, an ordeal that had bitterly taught him the folly of hope, he now found himself clinging white-knuckled to that most reviled of human fallacies. It manifested as the skinning knife gripped tightly in his hands, as the stubborn gleam burning defiantly in his pale blue eyes. Registering that look, the beast's grotesque visage contorted into a frown before it lunged with staggering swiftness. Instinct propelled Northern into frantic motion, ducking and weaving on clumsy but desperate reflex as his father's combat lessons echoed faintly through muscle memory. The monster's thick tail whipped through the air like a scything blade, the wind of its passing caressing Northern's cheek with lethal intimacy. Yet the relentless fiend flowed with unnatural, fluid grace, a guttural growl preceding its next blurred advance as Drool's slick fangs snapped shut inches from Northern's face. His heart kick drummed against his ribs as he swung the knife in a wild, desperate arc, praying for a miraculous strike. But the beast contemptuously batted the pitiful assault aside, serrated claws raking across Northern's side in a blaze of searing agony. He reeled backward, gasping for breath, his vision wavering in and out of shadow. The creature inexorably advanced, four baleful eyes narrowing in predatory satisfaction. Pouring his waning strength into one final, foolhardy lunge, Northern thrust the skinning knife towards the beast's armored throat with both hands, only for the fiend to disdainfully deflect the blow with a lazy swipe. Its free set of raking talons closed around Northern's windpipe like a viscerot, hauling him off his feet with horrific ease. Mr. Fluffy shot forward with a panicked squeak upon seeing Northern captured in the monster's crushing grip, but a contemptuous flick of its powerful tail swatted the Kuik tumbling away. Darkness encroached on Northern's fading vision as he glimpsed the night terror's cruel, victorious leer, the last sight etching itself into his faltering consciousness before oblivion claimed him. Chapter 25. What is after here? Northern's eyes slowly fluttered open. At first, everything was a blur, but as his vision came into focus, an unfamiliar scene materialized before him. He found himself lying on a rugged bed of red stone that undulated like petrified waves across the cavern floor. A dank, earthy aroma permeated the air, assaulting his nostrils and churning his stomach. Though the space resembled a cave, an ominous gray sky loomed openly overhead. To his right and left, ancient iron bars blackened by time and decay enclosed the area, their once sturdy forms now corroded and crumbling. At Nobleman at. A feeling of unease washed over Northern as he took in his unfamiliar surroundings. Where was he and how did he get here? His head hurt the moment he tried to think, but it did not impede his thoughts. Northern remembered well the horror he encountered just a few minutes ago. I thought I died. Northern stood up slowly from the stony ground. He looked around trying to figure out where he could be, but there was no information whatsoever that could hint at his location. It wasn't like he knew anywhere in this rift. At least the sky felt familiar, and the land was not a sea of red. Instead of that murky one, this seemed like red stone that had precipitated over time. The next thing that bothered him were the iron bars that stood on both ends of his vision. Then the sound of metal caught his attention, making him turn to the back, which he hadn't noticed since he woke. Another thick wall of iron barricaded the back, its door opened slowly, creaking eerily as it did. Northern paled, staggering backward as he saw a grotesque monster walk through the door. The foreboding critter walked on two trunk-like legs, its presence a chilling blend of terror and martial might, each step thunderous and deliberate, shaking the very ground beneath its weight. Its skin a patchwork of scars and thick, leathery hide, a testament to battles and the harshness of its existence, conveying a sense of fear. The monster's body was grotesquely muscular, with bulging limbs that seemed to twist and contort in ways that defied nature. Its hands, if they could still be called that, clutched a weapon forged not by the finesse of human craftsmanship but in the fires of savagery and necessity. It wielded a crude axe, its surface pitted and stained with the remnants of past conflicts. Northern's heart trembled as the monster got closer to him. Had he survived the terror only to get maimed by another? After several steps, the crude creature stopped, looking down on him. Its eyes burned with a feral glow, set deep within a face that was more snout than nose, with jagged teeth protruding from its maw. But there was something strange about the look in the eyes of this monster. Northern gulped as he stole a glance at the grotesque face. He lowered his head, paralyzed by the quaking fear in his body. The monster turned, walking towards the iron bars affixed to the far end of the right wall. While that happened, Northern's head screamed for him to run, to save himself while the monster walked towards the wall. But his legs could not move. Northern tried to prompt himself into motion, but it was utterly futile. Having experienced the same situation perhaps day after night, Northern's nerves were frozen from the manifestation of fear. He could not move, until the monster got to the bars, bent down and picked something up, and came back. The monster dropped a brown metal object on the ground with a thud ringing through the air. Northern looked at the metallic rod. It was like an axe, however, a menial one. The monster looked at him with a slight frown on its horrific face. An understanding dawned on Northern as the monster stared at him, waiting for him to do something. Northern, slowly and fearfully picked up the metal. As he did, the monster walked forward. It paused after 2 steps, looking back at Northern, who was still standing in the same spot. Northern tentatively hurried forward, following the monster at a careful distance as it trekked further. After a while, they stopped at the first hill of waves that marked the landscape. The monster looked at him, yanked the axe from him, and with a spin, hammered it onto the hill. A deafening ring streaked across the air, trembling Northern's bones. With that one heavy strike, the hill cracked. And as the monster raised the axe and struck it a second time, splinters of red shards sprang out, falling around. The monster pointed the axe at Northern. Shakily, Northern received it and watched the monster retrieve all the shards of red crystals that broke out of the red stone. A deep confusion contorted his pale, dirty and bloodied face. Northern stared in ambiguity. What is this? What is going on? The monster put all the shards at one point and turned to Northern, frowning its face. Northern, with the axe in his hands, fear in his heart and millions of questions on his mind, gripped the axe. The first strike, sloppy, was a praise. Northern almost tripped from his own swing. The moment he carried the axe, its heaviness fell on his muscles. He wasn't expecting it, and it was too much for his scrawny muscles to handle. Plus, belatedly realizing its weight, Northern's coordination faltered, and he ended up scraping the side of the axe against the hill's slope, staggering to the side and almost tripping. The monster stared indifferently, but Northern took a glance back. In that cold stare, he could feel the shrewd disappointment lurking behind it. He picked the axe up again, biting his teeth. He struck the hill. His second trial was a bit better than the first, but equally sloppy and lame. The monster moved the moment splinters of the red rock flew out from Northern's impact. After that, it would return to its original position, petrified and unfazed by anything that happened. Consistently, it felt like Northern was being watched by death itself as he persistently smote the rock with the black axe in his hands. Night came, and further nights came. The sound of Northern's axe smiting the rock soared like the sound of a novice blacksmith forging the night into a weapon of sound. Chapter 26: The Minor. Rifts were embodied dimensions, manifested through cracks in space. It was impossible to predict or accustom to the environment of a rift. Since they tore apart several dimensions and manifested them into TRAL space, diversely unique dimensions with climates and weather conditions never known to humans could be discovered. Some with uncanny conceptual laws tied to their worlds. Of course, the more foreboding thing about rifts was the ranks of monsters that existed in them. They posed a level of uncertainty and danger of the unknown that should make every drifter not want to venture into such realms. However, the rewards were equal compensation for the vicious risks that they experienced in them. A drifter, through such hardship, gains more soul essence, gradually progressing through the ranks of their soul. Of course, the higher they climb, the harder it is for them to climb. That is why the highest soul rank of drifter recorded in this day and age was a grandmaster. Even though other soul ranks clearly exist, everyone had now considered those the planes of immortals, untouchable by mortals such as they. Those ranks have surpassed even the broken limitations of the strongest mortals. It would take unearthly resolve to reach such ranks. Perhaps, at such a point, they become monsters themselves. Because the might of a grandmaster is already dangerous enough. Being able to upheave plains with just a stomp of their foot, make earthquakes swim through mountains with just a spirit release. Grandmasters were tremendous powerhouses that could never be contained. They, very few of them, stood at the pinnacle of it all. At noblemen at. Another thing that gave drifters the courage to venture into drifts, even with the dangers that lurked within, were the varieties of discoverables. Martial arts, spell arts, body constitution arts, spiritual release arts. All of them, grimoires of skills that boosted the drifter's arsenal by leaps and bounds, gave them more areas to which their talent ability was applicable, and made it so that even a drifter with a low-class talent was still given a lot of chance to grow. A world of fairness. Of course, that fairness in and of itself was now being bought, manipulated by the upper echelon, leaving the plebeians with nothing but scraps and expecting them to be grateful for it. Resources cultivated in a rift were tremendously sought after. Those valuables had become the raw material for the progression of TRAL's civilization: monster carcasses, minerals, and crystals. These resources, when brought back to their home world, could be sold for hefty amounts of money. Items. Items were another part of exploring a rift that brought an overwhelming sense of achievement and compensation for their hardship. When monsters were killed or ruins were explored, Ul rewarded the slayer with an item woven from the fate of the slain monster. The items had the foundation and source of existence created from the strings of fate that controlled the monster and its connection to the rift. Their details of existence, enchantments were all related to their source. And they were available in different grades, each one more detrimental than the former. Even though all these perks were enticing, drifters died like insects every now and then inside rifts. So, yes, many more retired at an early age, gave up on the dream of becoming stronger, and treasured the rest of their lives as lower-tier rifts drifters, explorers, private tutors, and citadel instructors. And that was why someone like Ruffsberg saw a need for there to be a stronger generation of drifters, forged through hardship and in the scorching flames of difficulty. In an unfair world where there was supposed to be no chance of survival. However, there are some things even Ruffsberg never predicted or expected. The passage of time became irrelevant to Northern's existence. Sufferings, plights, unanswered questions, his fears, and never satisfied hunger. Northern did not know how time passed. The sky hung stubbornly above his head. Night followed nights and nights. There was neither a moon nor a sun in this realm. Everything looked just the same before his eyes. Over and over again, the poor boy continued to mine red crystals. At first, he questioned why the only thing he was doing was mining crystals. When the crystals had piled up to a certain degree, his watchdog would pick up the crystals and go out of Northern's mining prison. That period was the only time he had to rest from sore muscles. It was also the time a strange food would be thrown over the wall of iron that held the door. The meal he was given was very inconvenient. Eating it the first and second time, Northern puked. It seemed like a baked round bread, but Northern's guess was that it was not baked using flour like his mother would do it. He didn't know what it was, but the thing churned his stomach every time he took it. Of course, he soon got used to it, which was very frightening to him. He could have turned to his roasted monster meat, but since he woke up in this strange place, Northern had not seen his bag or his shirt. He had been working shirtless, but the fortunate thing was that the weather was not too harsh. There were nights that were unbearable, and the monster would stand behind him, a deep scowl on its face, and its hand clenched tightly on its axe. For Northern, he slowly got used to the monster staying around and got used to mining too, having fewer hours of sleep, eating shitty food, and abandoning the common sense of inquisitiveness. As night climbed upon nights, he slowly lost hope and became enchanted by the expectation of looking forward to the times the monster would go away, so he would at least be able to catch some sleep or eat, or rest. When the monster stayed around, his hands never stopped moving, blisters burst on his palms and reformed on areas they had burst. It happened over and over again, even when his legs shook, hands trembled, the monster scowled at him like he was testing the imminent scythe of death. Everything became null. There was nothing he could do except mine crystals. However, one day, something happened. Chapter 27 What is Fear? In those first indeterminable nights acclimating to the miner's axe's punishing weight and rhythm, fragmentary notions began crystallizing for Northern amid the scant respites of rest and meager sustenance. First, he wasn't alone. Other wretched souls, perhaps human or bestial in nature, surely suffered similar brutal captivity elsewhere in this subterranean gulag, enslaved to mine these strange red crystals for purposes as opaque as their jailer's motives. It wasn't far-fetched to hypothesize this dismal delving represented the lair, or even unholy breeding pits, of the same abyssal fiends responsible for the Crimson Massacre where his nightmare began. Speaking of those peculiar crystals, from the first moment of waking Northern had sensed a viscerally disturbing kinship between their ruddy hue and the coagulated sea of blood painting that lethal wasteland. Though he initially dismissed the notion as mere shock-addled delusion, each swing of his axe driving deeper only reinforced the sickening twinges of recognition. For the Aben cord crystals appeared to resonate with a sort of sanguine malevolence. The further Northern hacked, the more tangibly that bloodlust solidified into a phantasmal edge slicing his already flayed skin with every fatigued descent of the blade. His brutish overseer, naturally, evinced neither interest nor apparent awareness of this disturbing phenomenon. Northern struggled vainly to work around it, to no avail. The relentless grind permitted no pauses, no lateral shifts until the hill had been thoroughly quarried. The process unfolded in ruthless stages. First batting aside the crimson shell, encasing the crystals with heavy, thunderous downswings, a feat the monster achieved with negligent ease, before systematically excavating the malefic cores through exhausting, piecemeal shattering strikes. Whether those scarlet slopes stemmed from prolonged seepage of the crystals, sinister energies, or the inverse, remained an increasingly moot mystery in the face of ceaseless toil. The more Northern cogitated on the writhing auras suffusing his grim yield, the more it consumed what tattered composure he retained. For the grimmest soul peril facing this timid boy went beyond the back-breaking labor, the scourging wounds, malnutrition or sleep deprivation. More insidiously, Northern's very sense of identity, of personhood, gradually began unraveling amid the numbing rhythm of privation, terror and unremitting exertion. Naturally, at first he mounted furious interior resistance against that creeping dissociation, determined to cling to his individuality with every tattered scrap of willpower. This defiant spark revolutionized his fragmented notions toward a new, feverish hope blazing in his chest like a banked forge's smoldering coals, unrealistic, born of vengeance yet undeniably alluring. For with each agonizing cycle of woundings, enforced starvation and near perpetual consciousness, the battered captive's seething resentment toward his jailer mutated into a powerful, visceral desire for retribution. At first merely a bitter coping fantasy to blunt his suffering, this yearning calcified into solemn vow the first time Northern glimpsed the beast's aura flicker with outright murderous intent. A vampiric pall confirming his keeper ranked among the apex predators, on par with the dreaded night terror itself, if not mightier. That first inkling Northern might possess the capacity to oppose such an eldritch horror, however farcically, solidified his subversive daydreams into an almost religious zeal. He silently swore vengeance, no matter the odds or temporal insignificance of his thwarted existence. The epical instant crystallized one fateful cycle while he toiled through a haze of splitting blisters, seeping injuries and excruciating muscle seizes threatening to immobilize his limbs at any moment. The axe slipped from Northern's bloody grip, impacting the cavern floor with a dull clank that prompted an immediate reaction. The looming sentinel turned toward the lapse with a menacing growl as it clenched its own blade with predatory intent. Northern's eyes met its abyssal depths, recognizing yet again that unmistakable flicker promising a devastating reprisal. Enough. He was broken, teetering on utter defeat after weathering relentless nights blurring into a kaleidoscope of torment. Pain and despair welled up from deep within his core, mercilessly crushing his already fragile defenses. The axe slipped fully from his grasp as he sank to his knees, resolute. I can't continue this any longer. Death is preferable. All the stubborn bluster, the relentless internal pep talks insisting this was merely transitory, fleeting hardship before the agony miraculously ceased, those coping fictions shattered like spun glass. In that sobering epiphany, Northern realized the cowering lies he'd told himself to endure a hell no human should suffer. Either his prior resilience had been a valiant stance against despair, or this moment of feral resignation was the true cowardice, an excuse to surrender rather than persevere. He could no longer tell the difference. A turbulent torrent of madness, pain, and loss of identity consumed his consciousness. If death offered the only escape from this perpetual torment, then he was finally ready to embrace its void release. So be it. The monster unleashed another guttural bark and raised its axe high, sensing the kill. Northern didn't even try evading the lethal arc despite his father's meager combat tutelage screaming from some primal depth. However, in the last minute he managed to muster the feeblest sidestep, his legs threatening to buckle, as the brutal blade sheared through his tattered flesh in a blaze of searing agony. Arterial blood geysered from the wound as the beast wrenched its axe free in a slurry of gore. Wailing, Northern collapsed fully as the harrowing reality resounded in psychic parallax. I'm going to die. His vital reserves rapidly drained into the widening scarlet pool even as the sneering monster loomed above, pitiless executioner fixing to deliver the coup de grace. In those transcendent moments, Northern's two ephemeral lives flashed in vivid recollection. First his illness-addled struggle, then his second awakening in RighteousFilth resolved to seize a vibrant existence by achieving something extraordinary, be it academic brilliance or martial supremacy. Each path espousing a core tenet of rejecting the futility of hope in favor of unyielding self-actualization. Yet here he knelt in a gory purgatorial, clawing desperately at that discarded, quietly banked hope like a treacherous life raft despite his steadfast convictions. The harsh reality couldn't be starker, or more contemptibly wretched, and still, confronted by its monstrous harbinger, the abject truth remained that Northern lacked the stoic courage to fully embrace oblivion, to relinquish even the tenuous, self-deluded grasp on the dream of perseverance. For he harbored too many insidious fears snaking through his consciousness even as his lifeblood seeped away. The fear of experiencing death itself at the claws of this malign Goliath. The fear of never again glimpsing his loved ones, his parents, his unborn sister. The fear of failure, mediocrity, of being just another face lost to the vastness. At Novelban at. But perhaps most insidious, the fear of what unholy uncertainty awaited beyond this visceral torment. And those fears, those limitations, proved his undoing. As the jagged furrow in his shoulder radiated with searing torment, a piercing scream of anguish and rage tore from Northern's throat, contorting his ashen features into a primal visage. of mortal terror. The monster merely sneered and brought its axe half down in a brutal coup, smashing Northern's consciousness into blessed, infinite darkness. Chapter 28 Near-Death Experience. That was how Northern fainted a second time and was left in the embrace of time. The monster left for a while and didn't return. Food was not administered to him. He helplessly lay on the ground slowly expecting his death. He occasionally tried to summon his clone to try help him tidy up the wound and do something so he could survive. But the attempt was not successful. The only reason he could think of was that the clone didn't dissipate from back then. When Northern encountered the Night Terror, the clone was in front observing the surrounding. The Night Terror attacked from the back. At nobleman at. As a last ditch of his effort, he had ordered the clone not to come over to his side and make sure he stayed 100 meters away at all cost. After waking up there was no sign of the clone. He couldn't receive any mental report from it. Then he just thought the clone and failed, and summoning it with his angel of death stubbornly watching over him was a dumb call. He just needed to wait for some time when he could. The first time the monster left, he tried. It was futile. Northern didn't think about it. In fact, there was no chance to. But now that he desperately needed the clone to appear, he wondered about the things that could have gone wrong and also got to observe that either something was blocking his command or something was blocking him from using the talent ability. He doubted the latter was possible. The system is a concept of power that exists outside this world. He doubted if it was recognized at all. What is not recognized cannot be hindered, so most likely it was the former. Something was definitely blocking out his command. So many questions ran helter-skelter in his head as he laid in the puddle of his blood, staring at the joyless gray sky. Was the clone even alive? He couldn't feel it at all. In or out of it, he couldn't tell. Northern didn't tell how long passed. His stomach started to cry for food, nothing of which was given to him since the monster left. The bastard had probably communicated with the others to let him die. Maybe when he died, they would come with another replacement. At the very least he was getting the rest he desperately wished for. The hunger became unbearable for Northern, and when it did, he began to scramble for anything he could get his hands on. Wondering if maybe one day he had left scrubs of one of the baked monster bones they always served him, or maybe some kind of food had dropped from the heavens. With the harrowing pain on his shoulders, a sore muscle and a dirtied pale body designed with shallow red cuts. However, mining had its good effect on Northern's body. His pale and lean frame had not changed, but his muscles were now coiling beneath that ivory coat of his, abs subtly forming contours on his abdomen. Northern's body was slowly being smelted by the strenuous labor he was being put through. Right now, it was just covered in a pool of blood, those glory unseen. Northern was met with only one choice of food. Very little shards of red crystal that were impossible for the monster to pick but possible for him to, due to the difference of the kind of hands they had. Northern turned and slowly picked a tiny. The idea was crazy. Maybe it was an hallucination or just craziness. He saw it as a hardened blood meal that should at least satisfy him. If not, how is it supposed to release a killing intent that was as sharp as weapon of war? Only masters could use killing intents like that, and it was owed to the role that spiritual release played. Spiritual release was the act of using one's soul essence to manifest their spirituality into a tangible form. Most time it was an intangible form, but when used by master drifters, it could become an invisible blade capable of harvesting gore. A crystal being able to do such a technical thing was a wild thought. But it wasn't like it was impossible. After all, a crystal was playing the role of measuring drifters' soul power, another was serving as an anti-gravity source for a flying ship. Northern slowly moved the crystal into his mouth. To his shock, it wasn't that hard to chew on and left a slight bittersweet taste in his mouth. After that one, he looked around and pitifully crawled, leaving trace of his blood. He bit deep on his lips to endure the pain, then managed to chew on the crystal. Every time he crawled and ate the crystal, he ironed his mind with the hatred for the monster and swore that he was going to have his revenge no matter what. This monster and the Night Terror would die by his own hands, even if it was not this life and was the next. He promised himself as he fed on bittersweet crystals while painfully waiting for his end. But strangely that end got farther and farther away from him the more he fed on the crystals. Slowly, he gained the strength to stand, walk some few distance to pick up red crystals to it. Sometimes the effect on his stomach was dreadful to deal with. He would vomit blood and almost feel his intestines about to drop through his mouth. Other times it was in his stooling. He had marked a corner to the right side of the wall where he often dropped his poop. He was overall not enjoyable feeding on such a thing. However, Northern did not know why this thing was keeping him alive, so he just decided that he was going to live on it for as long as possible. Maybe till he is strong enough to swing the axe again. Time passed. Northern got plenty of rest. The gash on his shoulder was now a crude scar marking his left side. The small cuts had also become scars. His body was a patchwork of healed wounds. One day, the monster came in with a new prisoner, but saw its former prisoner standing healthy, a dark frown weathered on his face. The monster had clearly never expected Northern to survive a crude wound like that one. Northern picked the axe and confidently walked over to the monster. Looked him in the face, and for the first time since he found himself in the mine prison, his voice cold and shrewd. What? I am not done with you and you want to replace me? And that was how Northern won his place back in the mine prison. He wasn't sure what had happened. The other prisoner, a humanoid creature with the head of an insect, was taken out and the monster resumed its job as his angel of death. Northern mined diligently while thinking several ways to kill the monster, overpower it, ways he could grow stronger. However, nights flowed by like waves of sea. The distance of mined rocks Northern left behind him became frightening and alarming. And still, greater waves of rock merged with the horizon and seemed to even sprawled further than it. Thinking about it, how far it was, became a harrowing torment to his head. Over time he decided to take the things he could control by its helm. For now, the only thing was mining. He mined and soon was mining his mind again. At the very least nothing he did could ever get rid of the hatred he had for his angel of death and the night terror. Northern was quickly becoming a slave again. That was when two things happened. That day the number of talent fragments absorbed by Northern increased, yet he did nothing to deserve it. The second was, he got out. For the first time since reaching the prison, he saw the kingdom of Red Mine. Chapter 29 Lonesome Prisoner. That night, just like every other, Northern had mined a pile and his angel of date had packed it into a dirt bag. It slapped the bag over its shoulder, gave North a suspicious glare and strode out of his prison. At Nobleman at. Ever since Northern defeated death, the monster has been extremely cautious around him. Paid him extra attentions and was meaner than it usually was. Maybe because Northern had dared to oppose it once, or because Northern should have died from that attack, but some way he was now healthier, smiting the red rocks with a frightening vigor. Northern watched the monster go out and locked the metal door from outside. Seconds after it left, something wrapped in leaves fell over the metallic barricade. Northern hurtled towards it and picked it up. He tore open the leaves and plastered a disgusted look on it. No matter how much he got used to it, there was no way he would smile at the pungent smell that came from opening the meal. The bun was red and unsightly. Today's own seemed to be nourished by maggot. Maybe this is a meal for monsters. How in the world can they feed this to a human? From the next prisoner that was brought, Northern could tell that there were clearly monsters that were being forced into labors in this place. But he also made another preposition that they were as much humans as monsters in this place. Perhaps the students whom they were teleported together have been captured by the monsters too. When he thought like that, the fire in the cave made sense. Maybe a few people had also met the end of their fate at the hands of the night terror and have been brought to this red mine to harvest crystals. All of them were being treated like monsters, or maybe the monsters, despite the spark of intelligence that could be seen in their eyes, were not just intelligent enough to know that Northern was not a monster, at least not yet. Northern sighed and closed his eyes, holding his breath as he took a bite of the maggot-infested, baked blood meal. The bun was not satisfying. It had a bland, empty taste, and slipped inside his mouth. As he swallowed down, disgust washed his heart like a flood of bitter bile. The flavorless morsel slid lumping down his throat, leaving behind a coat of lifeless ash that seemed to drain the vitality from his tongue. The red crystal seemed like a better choice at this point. Northern looked at the bun with a sunken expression and muttered, "I've really suffered." He was about to turn when the sound of a beep entered his ear. System notification. You have slain a hazard fiend, Rot Walker. You have gained +2 talent points. Northern abruptly came to a stop with widened eyes. The bun slipped out of his hand as he stood frozen for a moment. A grin spread across his face. All this while, this bastard has been alive. But how was he surviving? Why was he not giving any mental report? Northern looked at the floor of red crystals that he had mined nights ago. They had become a coating of the ground itself, looking like a blood-infested area from afar. A flood of joy washed over Northern. It was good, even though he had questions as to how his clone is surviving in that harsh reality. He was happy. Now, his plan of escape was not daydreaming anymore. He could make it work. All he just needed to do was look for a way to communicate with the clone. Northern thought so. However, a few minutes later his hope was plummeted and crashed. Northern's eyes narrowed as he felt the clone return to his body. He sighed exasperatedly. Whatever the clone was fighting seemed to have gotten the best of it. But this is good at least. Now that my clone is back, I can still make this work. Just as Northern conceived that thought, a deafening horn resounded through the sky, calling the attention of every prison mine. The prison mine from the outside sprawled like several waves of mountain merged together by the force hand of a might weather effect through thousands of years. Then iron bars ran through the length, climbing up and down the waves to the peak of the mountain and down the other side of it. Each iron bar separated one mine from the other and like Thar ran over 1,000 walls with one prisoner occupying one prison mine. Each prisoner, guarded and monitored by a Hellion rank monster. When the prisoners died of exhaustion or were killed by their angels of death, they were left to rot in the cave, the red crystal absorbing their blood and using it as a source of nutrient to grow again. The crystal moss would often be found growing where their blood had dried up in. The monster would come back with another prisoner and have them start mining immediately. The piles of crystal were taken out and transported to a castle that was thrown afar to the north of the prison mile, transported by lower rank critters. Northern's face paled as he saw the door open on its own. He didn't waste time and ran towards it. Stepping out of the door, what met him was an overwhelming terrain of red rocks. Monsters of diverse kinds walking in a straight line being ordered around by even more horrific ones. They were just like his personal angel of death, except that they wielded different weapons, had different scars. One of them smacked Northern's head from behind, making him stagger forward. A large chain was taken and locked onto his neck, hands and legs. Then the monster growled to his face, its stinking breath assaulting Northern's nose. It dragged the chain and forced Northern forward. For a few seconds, Northern didn't know what to think. What had happened? Why were all these monsters being marched out of the mountain and towards the direction of the castle that nestled closer to the gray skies, far in the north? As these questions tugged his mind, Northern couldn't help but feel helpless. Another thing that worried him was, he had searched with quick glances since he had been on the line. Sometimes he would even turn his head back, attracting the attention of the monster. At his back was a humanoid monster with a rat face of some sort. He couldn't see the face of the monster at his front, but it had a tall build, muscles rolling beneath its dark skin like twisted cords. And a crudely burnt back. The one after it was another humanoid monster whom Northern couldn't get a good glimpse of. And the other both front and back. Northern was beginning to fear he could be wrong at this point. What was he to do if he was the only human in this prison? No, that can't be. Horror overwhelmed his face, turning it white pale. Chapter 30 Meet Shields. As they marched forward, Northern initially believed they were heading towards the castle. However, to his surprise, they continued past the castle, their journey persisting. With each step, the terrain of the mountain gradually transitioned from red to brown, and as they moved miles away from the castle, it transformed into a desolate black. They pressed on, unnoticed and disregarded. Any of the prisoners who couldn't keep up and collapsed were swiftly stabbed and killed by the merciless Hellions. Nothing hindered their march, not even a momentary pause. When the other monsters witnessed this brutal display, fear gripped them, compelling them to continue walking, even barefooted. They traversed stony tracks without any form of footwear, though it seemed like they were accustomed to such harsh conditions. However, for the lone human among them, it was a crude and uncomfortable experience. When he had first woken up after being captured by night terror, Northern realized that most of his belongings were missing. His bag, shirt, and leather boots had all vanished. What remained were his gray trousers, now blackened and stained with the dirt and dried blood of the mine. His trousers hung loosely from his waist, though not enough to fall without some effort. Occasionally, he had to pull them up to prevent further embarrassment, especially when they revealed the line of his exposed backside. Gradually, they departed from the rocky terrain and entered into black plains. The color of the sky subtly shifted from gray to black, enveloping them in an even darker night than the one they had endured in the prison mine. Northern had lost track of how long they had been trekking, but he estimated it to be at least 5 miles. At Nobleban at. The soles of his feet grew numb, torn by the sharp edges of the stones he stepped upon. His calves, knees, waist, and back ached with every step. Every part of his body screamed with pain. He longed to rest, but he knew it was not an option. These monsters wouldn't hesitate to plunge their weapons into his abdomen if he dared to halt. So, Northern, with a tortured mind, continued to move forward. Finally, their arduous journey came to an end. However, what Northern beheld did not bring him any relief. Before them stood a wall of monsters, lined up side by side, armed with crude weapons and emanating a bloodthirsty aura. The slaves trailed behind the monsters, and as they arrived, these vicious creatures strangely parted ways, allowing the slaves to walk through as if they were revered celebrities. As they reached the front row, Northern finally grasped the gravity of the situation. A horde of seething monsters lay in wait, their fiendish crimson gazes burning with frenzy. Reptilian legs scraped against the jagged ground beneath their warped, scaly hides. Curved black claws extended from gnarled hands, some wielding vicious weapons that gleamed cruelly in the gloom. Row upon row of jagged fangs lined their grotesque mouths, bared and poised to shred flesh. An aura of primal savagery enveloped the throng, their postures bent and tense, ready to charge with unrestrained violence. Their sheer numbers overwhelmed Northern, a mass of deformed flesh that filled the expanse. Amongst this feral horde stood the slaves, lined up at the front row alongside the monsters. Northern's eyes widened with realization. Are we going to be used as meat shields? He pondered. Perhaps he was overestimating these monsters, but it made no other sense why they would bring out all the prisoners, marching them miles to the heart of a battlefield. They couldn't fight, and even if they could, they were shackled. However, they would serve as effective shields for the monsters of the Kingdom of Red Mine to gain an advantage in battle. It appeared that the conflict was only just beginning, as the monsters seemed to have recently arrived as well. Northern briefly argued with this notion in his mind, only to be distracted by the emergence of figures from both sides. First, he caught a glimpse of a hulking creature stepping out from the opposing throng, emanating a palpable aura of malicious power and authority. Its eyes smoldered like embers, ready to ignite into pits of hellfire. Muscles rippled beneath its scar-crossed scales, ashen and smeared by splashes of blood from past battles. Its towering frame exuded sadistic strength, every inch etched with a sense of malevolence. With each heavy step, a subtle growl escaped its maws, until it reached the center of the throng, directly facing them. Northern's gaze slowly shifted to his side, where another monster emerged from the crowd of slaves, advancing to the front. As luck would have it, Northern found himself standing in the center of the front row. His eyes widened as the monster approached him. Intense anger surged through his veins as he recognized the familiar face. Four hollow red eyes gleamed viciously with predatory intent. Northern could feel the waves of pride and raw power emanating from the creature's gaze and imposing stance. There it stood, the monstrous being, holding a spiked club with its wicked talons like scythe. Its sinuous tail coiled beneath its legs, poised for lethal action. Northern glared at the creature from behind, his eyes narrowing with a fierce intensity. It was a pitiful realization that no matter how consumed he was by anger or how desperately he yearned to vanquish this monster, he remained utterly unnoticed, despite its blatant presence before him. The fact that he couldn't even leave a scratch on its formidable form, let alone slay it, stoked the fires of Northern's fury. It was very annoying that he was not being noticed by the very embodiment of terror that he despised so vehemently. Since arriving on this dark continent, Northern had witnessed a little bit of harshness, but he had never killed a monster with his own hands. Except, of course, through the actions of his clone. He lacked the blood-stained hands necessary to wield the intangible weapon of bloodlust. No matter how deep his hatred or thirst for vengeance, his lack of bloodshed rendered him invisible to creatures that oozed with an insatiable craving for violence. With a fierce glare etched upon his face, Northern continued to observe the night terror's back. Little did he expect that the very monster that had attacked and brought him here was none other than the commander of the entire army of the Kingdom of Red Mine. A tumultuous mix of pride and hatred surged within him, the latter stemming from his realization that this terror was the root cause of all his suffering. The mere thought of it caused his blood to boil uncontrollably. Yet, alongside his resentment, he couldn't help but acknowledge the sheer might and power possessed by this terror. Was he secretly rooting for the Kingdom of Red Mines, despite everything? As the terror took a step forward, its talons extended, revealing bulging black veins pulsating beneath its skin. Planting its clawed feet firmly into the ground, it unleashed a guttural growl that resonated through the air, deafening to the ears. The commander of the opposing army responded with an echoing growl of its own. In an instant, the night terror lunged forward, transforming into a shadow that seamlessly melded with the enveloping darkness of the night. Chapter 31 Survivalist. Northern cast a fleeting glance as the two generals clashed. It was a heavy collision of steel against steel. Despite their monstrous nature, they wielded crude weapons instead of fighting with claws and fangs. Their battle was a spectacle to behold. Strikes curved through the air like arcs of moonlight on a solemn night, their styles distinct and destructive. In a matter of seconds, the ground was already spitting stone shards in response to the brutal intensity of their combat. Unfortunately, Northern didn't have the opportunity to witness more of the battle, as the clash served as a signal for both armies to engage. The enemy charged forward like a stampeding horde of buffaloes, their guttural battle cries shaking the ground beneath their feet. The slaves were being mercilessly pushed to the front, prodded with weapons, forced to sacrifice themselves for the kingdom. Gritting his teeth, Northern watched as the horde of monsters hurtled toward them like mad horses. Was this the end of the line for him? My story hasn't even begun, damn it. Northern refused to entertain thoughts of imminent demise. His past brush with death had taught him a crucial lesson, one etched into his mind and woven into his very being: fear. It coursed through his veins, making his heart quake, yet it did not render him a coward. Surviving that ordeal had taught him that there was nothing wrong with desperately clinging to life. Boldly accepting death was foolish, and no one should be ashamed of fearfully scrambling for a way to survive. After miraculously escaping the clutches of death by consuming the red crystals to sustain himself, Northern had adopted a survivalist mindset. He would do whatever it took to outwit the merciless grip of death. He would become invincible, a bastard that even survival itself could not defeat. His brows furrowed as he desperately searched for a way out of this impending doom. Think, think, think. Come on, Northern, think. The horde of monsters drew closer with each passing moment, the line of slaves standing before them, waiting to be slaughtered. Fear and horror were etched on the faces of these captured creatures. Northern himself wore a mask of fear, but there was also a dangerous spark lurking within him, waiting to ignite and overpower those horrific sentiments. Instinctively, Northern did something he never thought he would stoop to. As the horde of monsters clashed with the slaves, blood flowed artfully and weapons swung crudely, slashing through the defenseless captives. In that fleeting moment before the lines collided, Northern fell to the ground, timing his descent with the swing of one monster's weapon. He managed to fall faster than the weapon could reach him, although his calculation was slightly off, resulting in a shallow wound across his previously unscarred shoulder. Remaining motionless on the ground, Northern endured the weight of stomping monsters and the fallen bodies. He didn't so much as twitch a muscle. Pretending to be dead was the easiest way out of this nightmare. He would lie here for as long as it took, until the war was over and the monsters had retreated. Then he would rise and find a way to escape from this hellish realm. He steeled his mind and braced himself for the rest of the battle, knowing that more bodies would fall on him and many more would trample him. Using the slaves as human shields had been a strategic move. It had given the monsters of the Red Mine the momentum they needed. Having to focus on slaughtering a group of slaves before reaching their enemies had worn down the opposing monsters, even if only slightly. But that slight advantage was more than enough. The war swiftly descended into a gruesome bloodbath, its echoes mingling with the mournful wind of the night. The sounds of merciless slaying were like a melancholic symphony, a haunting melody that resonated through the air, painting the battlefield with a macabre and tragic ambiance. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the acrid stench of monster sweat and fear. The once serene night was shattered by the cacophony of battle, a symphony of clashing weapons, agonized screams, and guttural roars. The darkened sky served as a somber backdrop, its vast expanse marred by swirling clouds of dust and smoke. The moonless sky, furtherly obscured by the haze, miraculously, cast an eerie glow that intensified the macabre scene below. Shadows danced and writhed, casting grotesque silhouettes upon the blood-soaked earth. Everywhere one looked, there were scenes of unimaginable carnage. Limbs severed and torsos rent asunder littered the ground, creating a grotesque tapestry of broken bodies. Pools of crimson spread like sinister ink, merging together to form a river of death that snaked its way through the battlefield. The guttural cries of the wounded and dying critters echoed through the night, mixing with the triumphant roars of the monsters of the Red Mine. It was a discordant chorus that seemed to reverberate off the very souls of those unfortunate enough to bear witness to this gruesome spectacle. Overwhelming this spectacle were two vicious entities, towering above the rest with an air of ruthless power. The Night Terror, a hulking figure, possessed both brute strength and surprising agility, making him a formidable force on the battlefield. His opponent was no less fearsome, matching the Night Terror blow for blow with lightning-fast reflexes and fluid movements that hinted at desperation. This opposing general shared similarities with the Night Terror, both being bipedal monsters. However, its vulture-like muzzles, adorned with three flaming eyes on each side, and jagged needle-like teeth concealed within its menacing jaws, set it apart. At nobleman at. Its snake-like tongue slithered in and out with each breath, adding an eerie touch to its already grotesque appearance. Unlike the Night Terror's dark fur, this monster boasted sleek gray scales that wrapped around its corded muscles like the coils of a titanic python. Its tail, tipped with a sharp metallic end, was imbued with a deadly poison that struck relentlessly but never found its mark against the Night Terror's agile defenses. The Night Terror's mastery of the battlefield was evident in the way he effortlessly navigated the clash between the two generals. His movements were calculated and precise, as if he had choreographed the battle itself, exploiting every opportunity to strike with lethal efficiency. With each swing of his weapon, he displayed a mastery of both strength and finesse, overpowering his opponent with a relentless onslaught. The opposing general, while matching the Night Terror's monstrous attacks with swift reflexes and blinding speed, there was an underlying sense of urgency in its movements. The opposing general spun and moved with a frenzied energy, almost as if driven by a desperate desire to gain the upper hand. Its strikes were executed with a hint of recklessness. It threw itself into the fight with a fervor that bordered on desperation, seeking to exploit any opening that presented itself. The general's movements, while swift and agile, carried an air of unpredictability. It darted and weaved, its attacks becoming a blur of motion, as if hoping to overwhelm the Night Terror with sheer speed and ferocity. Despite the opposing general's skill and tenacity, there was an underlying frustration that manifested in its actions. Its strikes, though swift and powerful, lacked the precision and finesse of the Night Terror's calculated moves. It seemed to be grasping at straws, desperately attempting to find a weakness in the Night Terror's defenses. Each failed attempt only seemed to fuel its desperation further, intensifying its efforts to break through its opponent's formidable guard. Chapter 32 Clash of the Two Generals. With a primal roar, the Night Terror shot forward in a mesmerizing display of calculated grace. He weaved through the onslaught of the opposing general's frenzied strikes, each dodge executed with the precision of a masterful dancer. His muscles rippled beneath his dark fur as he effortlessly evaded, his lithe form a blur of motion. As the opposing general's attacks grew more erratic, its desperation became palpable. It lunged forward, teeth bared and eyes ablaze. But the Night Terror was a maestro of defense, his instincts honed through countless battles. With a fluid motion, it sidestepped the general's reckless assault, leaving it off balance and vulnerable. Seizing the moment, the Night Terror struck with a thunderous force. Its massive club collided with the general's scaly hide, a symphony of bone-crushing impact. The force of the blows reverberated through the air. But the opposing general, driven by an unyielding will, refused to be defeated. It retaliated with a flurry of wild slashes, its movements resembling a frenetic dance. The Night Terror deftly parried and blocked, his thick arms moving with the fluidity of a serpent. Each clash of their monstrous forms sent shockwaves through the battlefield, as if the very earth trembled beneath their might. In an extraordinary display of agility, the Night Terror leapt over the general's sweeping tail, narrowly escaping its venomous strike. He landed with a thunderous thud, his eyes locked onto his opponent. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath as the two adversaries prepared for their next exchange. The Night Terror utilized its superior strength to its advantage. It seized the general's moments of vulnerability, striking with calculated precision. His club became blurs of motion, delivering devastating blows to critical points on the general's scaly body. The impact resonated through the air. The Night Terror's calculated barrage forced the opposing general back, each thunderous blow eliciting cracks along its scaling armor. Dark venom seeped from the fresh wounds, sizzling as they dripped to the war-ravaged earth. Seeing its advantage, the Night Terror pressed the assault. With blurring speed, its club wove mesmerizing patterns through the dust-choked air, seeking out vulnerabilities to smash through the general's weakening defenses. The opponents danced their lethal waltz across the battlefield's rough terrain, cratered and treacherous. As its strength rapidly faded, the desperate general changed tactics. If it could not outfight, it would outwit. Feigning a faltering step, it left an enticing gap for the Night Terror's attack. Sensing blood, the Night Terror committed to a mighty swing, as the general nimbly sidestepped, allowing the club's momentum to send its wielder lurching past. Before the Night Terror could recover, the general wheeled and slashed the sharp end of its tail across the domineering creature's undefended flank. The Night Terror bellowed in surprise and rage as the vicious spike impaled its dark fur and tore free in gory tracks. It staggered from the underhanded assault, but maintained its footing. Endless and merciless battles in the glory of the Kingdom of Red Mines had honed its fortitude as well as deadliness. The monster stabbed its black talons into the part that had been slashed, tearing it up and leaving itself with an even vicious injury. A primal fury surged through the Night Terror, fueling its every move. Its wounded flank throbbed with pain, but it only served to stoke the fires of its rage and burn the chars of the poison. With blood mixed with the black fluid of poison dripping from its torn fur, the monster's eyes burned with an intensity that could scorch the very soul, After staring for a few seconds, the Night Terror released its grip on the club, making it slip out of its hand. The Night Terror lunged forward with fearsome determination, its movements no longer calculated and precise, but driven by an overwhelming desire to dominate. Its claws extended like deadly talons, slashing through the air with a ferocity that echoed the wildness of its heart. The opposing general, an abhorrent creature itself, sensing the unleashed fury of the Night Terror, faltered for a moment. Fear flickered in its eyes, a realization that it had awakened a force beyond its control. Yet defiance still lingered within its wounded form, a stubborn refusal to succumb without a fight. The Night Terror closed the distance in an instant, its monstrous strength propelling it forward like a force of nature. The impact of its assault was cataclysmic. With a single swipe of its clawed hand, it cleaved through the general's defenses, tearing through scales and sinew with a sickening crunch. The opposing monster cried out in anguish as its lifeblood spilled onto the ravaged earth. But even in that dying moment, it mustered one final act of defiance. With a desperate surge of energy, it lashed out, sinking its jagged needle teeth into the Night Terror's arm. A feral growl rumbled deep within the Night Terror's chest as it felt the opposing general's jaws sink into its arm. Pain seared through its monstrous form, fueling the blaze of its fury. With a primal snarl, the Night Terror unleashed a savage barrage of blows upon the general's head. Each strike landed with bone-shattering force, sending shockwaves rippling through the air. The general's scales cracked and splintered, its grip weakening with each devastating impact. Blood sprayed in crimson arcs, mixing with the dust of the battlefield. In a final act of desperation, the opposing general released its hold and attempted to scramble away. But the Night Terror would not allow such a shameless retreat. Its eyes glowed with an unholy fire as it lunged forward, closing the distance in a heartbeat. With a mighty swipe of its massive clawed hand, the Night Terror's strike caught the general's flank, tearing through flesh. The opposing monster howled in agony, its cries reverberating through the battlefield. The weight of its impending demise hung heavy in the air. But before the Night Terror could deliver the final blow, the general mustered a burst of fleeting strength. With a desperate surge, it managed to free itself from the monster's grasp and staggered to its feet. Blood trailed behind it, marking its path of retreat. The Night Terror's eyes blazed with an unyielding rage as it watched the general's feeble attempt to escape. It would not allow its adversary to flee without consequence. With a ground-shaking roar, the Night Terror gave chase, its monstrous form thundering across the battlefield. The general, its movements hindered by its wounds, stumbled and faltered. It could feel the Night Terror closing in, its relentless pursuit driving fear deeper into its already battered heart. The monster's dominance was undeniable, an overwhelming force that left no room for hope. As the general reached the edge of the battlefield, it cast one final desperate glance over its shoulder, meeting the Night Terror's burning gaze. In that moment, a mixture of terror and resignation filled its eyes, a silent acknowledgement of its imminent defeat. With a final burst of speed, the Night Terror closed the gap, its outstretched claws reaching for its retreating foe. But just as the monster's talons were about to find their mark, the general disappeared into the shadows of the surrounding forest, leaving the Night Terror standing at the precipice of its victory. At Nobleban at. The battlefield fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the heavy panting of the Night Terror and the distant clash of whatever was left of both armies. Night Terror's chest heaved as it surveyed the battlefield, a testament to its domineering strength and unyielding will. With their general gone, more and more monsters were falling to the blades and fangs of the Kingdom of Red Mine. The battlefield was scanty, with a flood of bodies sprawling on the ground. With a defiant howl that pierced the silence, the Night Terror raised its head to the dark sky, its thunderous roar echoing across the empty expanse. The ground trembled beneath its mighty form as it stood victorious, a silhouette against the backdrop of the battlefield. Witnessing the Night Terror's display of raw power, many of the opposing forces faltered, their resolve crumbling like brittle stone. Its domineering strength sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks, shattering their morale and instilling a deep sense of fear and doubt. The battlefield, once a fierce battleground, now became a chaotic scene of disarray and retreat. The Night Terror's triumph served as a rallying cry for forces of the Kingdom of Red Mine, igniting a maddening ferocity in their eyes. Inspired by their general's domineering strength, they launched with a frenzied fervor, tearing through the remnants of their opposition with reckless abandon. As Night Terror's victory spread throughout the battlefield, it struck a heavy blow to the enemy composure. Their general, a supposed symbol of their strength and leadership, had shamelessly fled. With their morale shattered and their ranks in disarray, the enemy forces found it increasingly difficult to mount a coordinated defense. Night Terror stared into the darkness of the forest one last time, as its allies brought the battle to a definite end, for now. Chapter 33 Reality of the Situation. Northern's eyes shot open, but to his surprise, there was no noticeable difference between having them open or closed. At some point, while enduring the numbing pain of being trampled on and the stench of the monsters that piled upon him, everything became distant. Somehow, he managed to sleep through it all. Now awake and reflecting on the situation, he wondered. How could anyone sleep in such a dire situation? Or maybe I was just tired. He excused himself and shifted his attention to his surroundings. Breathing slowly and silently, he listened for the faintest sounds that could indicate if the monsters were still engaged in battle. It would be a shame to have endured so much only to die now, so he waited cautiously, aware that the monsters could either be finishing their fight or looting the spoils of war. He had to be extremely careful, paying close attention to every detail. He remained motionless for several minutes, confirming that there was not a single sound before finally rising. Northern fought his way through the pile of bodies and emerged, standing in the center of the fresh battlefield. The ground was adorned with crimson blood, and bodies were strewn about haphazardly. The sight made him nauseous. He covered his mouth and nose with his hand to ward off the pungent smell of blood, feeling his heart squirm. No sane person could endure such a sight without being affected. The monsters' viscera were gruesomely exposed, their limbs twisted and contorted. Northern could only imagine the pain they must have felt. With a pale face, he shook his head and stooped down, picking up a weapon from one of the fallen monsters. It resembled a scimitar, with a crude curve that seemed eager to rend flesh. He tightened his grip around the handle, feeling its unfamiliar weight. It was a departure from the thin rod of an axe he had been wielding for the past few nights, at Nobleman at. Well, I'm sure I will eventually get used to it, not that I can even use it, he muttered to himself. His gaze shifted to the pile of corpses he had just emerged from. After taking a couple of seconds to collect himself, he began to dissect the monsters, skillfully extracting their organs and soul cores. Harvesting organs and monster cores was something he excelled at. When he used to hunt with his father, they would gather these parts to sell, and sometimes Shin would give the cores to children in the town who were going through their first awakening, in hopes of increasing their chances of a second awakening. The first awakening marked the formation of their soul core and the awakening of their talent. The more soul essence they absorbed, the more saturated their own soul core would become. This played a crucial role when the walking came. By filling their soul cores, they would become physically stronger, even without having names or attributes. It provided them with a larger energy pool to utilize their talent abilities. However, they needed to become drifters to refine their soul cores further and draw out a richer soul essence. The difference between the soul essence of walkers and that of drifters was that for walkers it served as a mere pool for their abilities to be used, while drifters can use it broadly: spirit release, application in martial arts or spell arts, activation of item skills. Everything about walkers was unrefined. Thanks to Shin's unwavering assistance, the villagers had grown to love his family and care for them deeply. Even the town chief turned to Shin when faced with a crisis. Adding to that, his son's flawlessly handsome appearance made his entire family known throughout the entire town, which sometimes bothered Northern. Thinking about it now, it stirred up some emotions within him. He held back the tears threatening to escape and focused on the task at hand, retrieving the soul cores. His eyes widened as he retrieved them. 2 soul cores. That's a savage rank, Northern gasped in surprise. With a suspicious frown on his face, he moved on to the next monster and began cutting it open. To his surprise, he found 2 soul cores again. This pattern continued with each monster he examined. Each one had at least 2 soul cores. Does this mean that both the forces from the Kingdom of Red Mine and their foes consist entirely of savage rank monsters? The realization struck him, and lines of stress formed beneath his eyes. The tiers of rifts corresponded to the rank and danger level of the monsters within them. Tier 1 rifts: Fiends, Savage. Tier 2: Fiends, Savages, Beast. Tier 3: Savages, Beasts, Hellion. Tier 4: Savages, Beasts, Hellions, Maelstrom. Tier 5: Beasts, Hellions, Maelstrom, Destroyer. Tier 6: Beasts, Hellions, Maelstroms, Destroyers, Behemoth. Tier 7: Hellions, Maelstroms, Destroyers, Behemoths, Belial. Tier 8: Maelstroms, Destroyers, Behemoths, Belials, Leviathan. Tier 9: Destroyers, Behemoths, Belials, Leviathans, Titan. Tier 10: Behemoths, Belials, Leviathans, Titans, Infernal. Of course, what made these rifts truly dangerous were the danger level of monsters that resided within them. While it was impossible for monsters to change their rank, even through consuming cores of their kind, stronger or weaker, the best outcome was for them to reach the peak potential of their respective ranks. Once that threshold was surpassed, the monsters would be classified into different danger levels. These danger levels served as indicators of a monster's unpredictability, making the rifts highly volatile and extremely perilous. Although Northern had not personally experienced these dangers firsthand, he was well acquainted with them through his extensive reading and his father's experience. Since arriving on the Dark Continent, he had encountered monsters with 2 cores, while those with a single core were a rare sight. When he contemplated the strength of these monsters in comparison to the Night Terror, the creature that triggered the start of his hell, he couldn't help but imagine the Night Terror's ability to decapitate them effortlessly in a single swing. It was no coincidence. The Night Terror was indeed that formidable, given its position as the army's commander. Northern was certain that the Night Terror possessed the exact level of power he envisioned. It was likely a disaster-level Hellion, or perhaps even worse, a calamity level. The disparity between it and the monster guarding his prison did not seem too significant. That one is most likely a Hellion rank as well, but with a lower danger level, Northern speculated. However, there was no definitive way to ascertain this without a scout. Scouts were skilled drifters who possessed the talent abilities that allowed them to discern a monster's rank by knowing the number of soul cores it possessed without needing to dissect its abdomen. They were also responsible for determining the tiers of the rifts. Their missions involved venturing into the rifts to map them out, identifying the ranks and danger levels of the monsters within, documenting their locations, group dynamics, and the Rift Guardian. Typically, the Guardian held a rank 1 level higher than the other monsters and there was only 1 Guardian per rift. I should probably acquire a talent that would enable me to determine such details in the future, Northern mused. He rose to his feet, revealing 2 more soul cores. His eyes narrowed with a hint of trepidation. Am I inside a Tier 3 rift? It was an unsettling realization. For Second Awakening, Tier 1 rifts was the norm. There had never been a situation where a walker walked into a Tier 3 rift. Of course, he knew he wasn't walking right now. He didn't form a soul core. His first awakening failed. Without a first awakening there was no reason for there to be a second, hence there was not subjected to walking even though his soul rank was walker. He knew little of the circumstances, but the act of being teleported was evidence enough that something was fishy somewhere. He had been intentionally brought to this place, in all likelihood. Northern sighed. What good does pondering do? Let's focus on surviving for now. He glanced at the pile of soul cores he had gathered, then lifted his head to survey the ghastly scene of corpses strewn across the macabre field. His grip tightened on the scimitar's hilt as he proceeded to cut up the next monster. Chapter 34 Escape Plan, Part 1. No matter how much Northern enjoyed looting the cores of these monsters, he couldn't do it for all of them. Besides the lack of a bag to store them, he couldn't afford to stay any longer. Who knew how long it would be before another monster, especially Night Terror, appeared? He recalled how he was caught the last time, right after a war. It was possible that Night Terror had been surveying the area for any survivors. Northern didn't want to be a victim of the same situation twice. After burying the pile of soul cores he had looted, Northern covered up the hole inside. It was a strategic location that he was sure he would be able to find again when he returned. The area, once a green field, was now blackened, soaked in blood, and littered with monster corpses. 3 rocks stood sparsely in the landscape, one smaller than the other 2. He didn't need to search for long. He would spot it immediately. The pile of cores was buried right beside the smallest rock. After confirming once more that it was relatively safe, well, as safe as one could be in this rift, Northern turned to the rock. His chains were long enough for him to move his hand freely. He raised the sword and struck the chain repeatedly, creating a clanging sound that resounded throughout the plain. It suddenly dawned on him that the noise could potentially attract attention. Walking while chained was far from ideal, but he had no choice. He had to run as far as he could within the limited time he had. Northern sprinted across the ground of corpses until he reached a dark forest. He paused for a moment, observing the forest warily. In this rift, nothing looked auspicious. He exhaled and continued, this time walking slowly while cautiously scanning his surroundings. After some time of careful progress, everything seemed calm. Northern felt his shoulders relax as he took the next steps with a smile on his lips. The past few days have been hellish, but for once in my entire life since arriving here, I feel at ease. However, in the next second, as Northern's gaze fell to the ground, his face froze and tensed. Crap, he whispered, realizing he had failed to notice the trails of black blood until now. Northern frowned deeply, unsure of what would happen next. Fear tightened its grip on his chest, squeezing his heart mercilessly. But he knew he had to keep moving forward. Even though his heart pounded with trepidation, he had to press on. If he turned back to find another route, he risked being discovered and taken as a slave, either by Night Terror or the enemy. One thing he didn't know was whose blood it was. It could be Night Terror's. Northern sneered at the thought. I doubt anything is capable of cutting that abomination. There were many possible answers to whose blood it could be. It might belong to an ordinary monster that had managed to escape. There was no way to know for sure. Running away wasn't the right call at the moment. Northern reassured himself and continued walking, keeping an eye out for the monster's blood. He walked a few meters without encountering any abominations. The forest was dark and shadowy, and at times, it seemed like the shadows lurking beneath and between the trees were alive, watching him cautiously. He glanced backward several times, feeling something slither away with incredible speed. Finally, his attention was diverted elsewhere. As he walked forward and turned slowly around a corner, a munching sound reached his ears, alerting all his senses. Northern immediately retreated to the back of a tree and tried to observe from that point. He moved his head slowly to catch a glimpse of what lay ahead. He saw a crude creature with bipedal legs and 6 vicious pairs of eyes, needle-like teeth tearing off a chunk of black flesh from a shadowy creature. The monster's body was smeared with black blood, and it had open wounds in several areas. Its ear twitched, causing it to turn its head slightly. At that moment, Northern quickly averted his gaze but couldn't stop himself from panting heavily. He recognized the monster. It was the enemy's general that had emerged before. Had Night Terror dealt with it in the same brutal manner? Northern couldn't decide whether to feel happy or scared, but a faint spark of satisfaction flickered across his face for being right about Night Terror. The forest whispered with a low rustling, catching Northern's attention. Something's approaching, he realized, his senses sharpening as adrenaline surged through him. Fearing the imminent threat of discovery, Northern opted for preemptive action. From the depths of a nearby tree trunk, his clone burst forth, a silent sentinel ready for battle. The approaching monster reacted with a snarl, its aggression palpable as it lunged forward with ferocious intent. With commendable agility, the clone lowered itself, a crude blade slicing through the air to graze the abomination's leg. The wound, though shallow, elicited a roar of pain as the monster recoiled, its focus momentarily diverted. Locked in a tense standoff, Northern and the monster exchanged glares brimming with hostility. Seizing the opportunity created by the distraction, Northern swiftly maneuvered behind the creature, his sword poised for a decisive strike. The blade arced through the air, aimed for the vulnerable spot at the back of the monster's neck. But before it could find its mark, the creature's reflexes kicked in with startling agility, evading the lethal blow in a fluid motion that belied its massive form. Surprised by the monster's unexpected maneuver, Northern's eyes widened in realization of its formidable capabilities. Wheeling around to face him, the monster unleashed a guttural roar, baring rows of razor-sharp teeth as it prepared to attack once more. With lightning speed, it launched itself forward, claws extended in a deadly onslaught. Northern dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the savage assault. In a swift counterattack, he unleashed a flurry of sword strikes, targeting the creature's vulnerable limbs and torso. Yet, despite its wounds, the monster proved to be a formidable adversary, its movements deft and unpredictable as it deflected and evaded Northern's blows with uncanny skill. As the battle raged on, Northern's mind raced, searching for a strategy to overcome the relentless onslaught. He knew brute force alone wouldn't suffice against such a formidable opponent. Moreover, the chains encumbering his movements posed a significant obstacle, a vulnerability that would have been exploited by a human opponent. Desperation mingled with determination as Northern sought a way to turn the tide in his favor. Chapter 35 Escape Plan, Part 2. As he flew back from a powerful clash with the monster, Northern crashed into a nearby tree and slumped to the ground. Slowly, he got up to uphold the sight of the towering abomination. A wave of doubt came crashing over Northern. Was he truly prepared to face a creature of such immense power? As he squared off against the monstrous foe, Northern's lack of combat experience weighed heavily on his mind. The only solace he found was in the muscle memory of countless sword drills ingrained in him since childhood. LHI's swordplay was rudimentary at best, lacking the finesse and deadly techniques needed to face a foe of this magnitude. His combat prowess was nothing remarkable, a fact he knew all too well. Any other student at the academy could have matched his skill with ease. Yet, amidst his shortcomings, Northern possessed a keen intellect that set him apart from his peers. Northern's sharp wit and keen observation skills were his greatest assets, allowing him to assess his own abilities and seek out opportunities for growth. His father's unwavering faith in him stemmed from his understanding of Northern's astute nature and relentless determination to excel, even with limited training. But his father's confidence in him had never been tested against the likes of a Hellion rank monster. Even a seasoned vagrant rank drifter like Shin would have found the challenge daunting, let alone a walker like Northern with little combat experience to speak of. Northern's acceptance of the perilous situation was tempered by a grim understanding that his actions bordered on reckless bravado. Desperation coursed through him, fueling a reckless determination to survive at any cost. If he wanted to leave this hellhole alive, he would need to seize every opportunity, no matter how daunting the odds may seem. Northern's hand vibrated as he attempted to tighten it around the sword. The abomination loomed over both of them, its massive form heaving with each breath, eyes burning with a primal intensity that sent a shiver down Northern's spine. Black fluid leaked down its side and yet it seemed unbothered. Northern squeezed his face. I have the upper hand. Somehow he just needed to hit where it already hurt. With an amusing determination, he streaked forward, his speed limited by the chains, but his clone was there to make up for the most part. It appeared from behind as Northern charged head front. The monster yanked forward both arms at the same time, frame of its hand writhing out like coily black whips, lashing out at both Northern. Simultaneously, Northern carried himself backward, narrowly escaping the onslaught. A drop of blood streamed down from a cut line on his face despite his desperate attempt. His clone, however, was more reckless. It dashed crazily, twisting itself beneath the whip, and yanking the rusting sword at the monster's side. Stabbing with a ferocious power into the previous injury sustained from its previous foe. Northern's eyes widened. What the? But he had no time to be surprised about anything. Seeing how the monster was thrown off by that attack, this was the best moment to end things. More so, the rusting weapon he picked for his clone was now suspended in the monster's body. His clone was unprotected. He shot off like a bullet, the moment he was about to carve a crude arc, and cleave the monster's flesh while it was heading for his clone. The limit of the chains decided to become an enemy, stopping his hand movement just above the vicious Hellion. Shit. He gritted his teeth annoyingly. His hands were far apart. Northern apparently had been moving with a substantial amount of consciousness that he is in chains, so he tried to not get in the way of his own movement himself. However, because of the urgency of the situation, this last moment had him thrown off. As Northern's hand hovered just above the monster's flesh, time seemed to slow down. The chains that bound him became a cruel reminder of his limitations, hindering his ability to strike the final blow. Frustration and anger welled up inside him, but he refused to succumb to despair. He had come too far to give up now. With a surge of determination, Northern shifted his stance, attempting to leverage his body weight to break free from the chain's grip. The metallic links strained under the pressure, creaking and groaning, but they held firm. Northern's muscles burned with the effort, his veins pulsating with adrenaline. Meanwhile, his clone used that opportunity to recklessly dive in again, draw out the blade and continued its frenzied assault on the monster, slashing and hacking at its flesh with the rusting sword. The monster thrashed and roared in pain, its massive form trembling under the relentless assault. The clone fought with reckless abandon, giving Northern a moment to himself. Northern's mind raced, searching for a solution. Desperation gave way to inspiration as a daring plan formed in his mind. He had to find a way to defeat the monster without breaking free from the chains. With a quick calculation, Northern adjusted his strategy. He focused on evasive maneuvers, dodging the monster's attacks with agility and precision. He danced around the creature, using his speed and reflexes to stay one step ahead. Every swing of the monster's monstrous arms missed its mark, while Northern's clone continued to strike at its vulnerable spots. Northern's eyes narrowed as he spotted an opening, a momentary lapse in the monster's defenses. With a burst of speed, he lunged forward, his sword aimed at the creature's exposed side. But just as he was about to strike, the chains pulled him back, restraining his movement again. Frustration surged through Northern's veins, but he refused to let it consume him. This time he decided to pay more attention to the limits of the chain. He had to adapt, to find another way to exploit the monster's weakness. With a quick shift in tactics, he focused on distracting the creature, drawing its attention away from his clone. He acted as the bait. He let out a guttural shout. Come at me, you bastard. As the monster turned its gaze towards Northern, his clone seized the opportunity. It darted in, slashing at the monster's tendons and ligaments, hampering its movements. The creature howled in pain, its strikes becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. At Nobleman at. Northern's heart pounded in his chest as he watched his clone fight on. Everything about it had changed, its movement. Perhaps the experience in the wilderness while Northern was captured had built up. Plus it better executed the tasks that Northern thought of more than Northern could ever. He couldn't break free from the chains, but he could still contribute to the battle in his own way. He just had to keep thinking and focus on the battle. As long as he did, his clone who didn't have to think was not delayed by the fraction of second between thinking and execution of task. With every ounce of concentration, Northern analyzed the monster's movements, searching for weaknesses that he could exploit. Which guided his clone, directing its strikes and maneuvers with precise timing. Together, they formed a deadly duo, one the brain, the other muscle. The battle raged on, the clash of steel and roars of pain echoing through the air. The monster fought back with a ferocity that matched its size, but the clone refused to back down. Besides, Northern was there to fill in for holes. Suddenly, Northern's clone launched a desperate attack. With a surge of strength, it plunged the rusting sword deep into the monster's heart. The creature let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing in its death throes. But even in its dying moments, it managed to strike a blow. A massive arm swung towards the clone, its impact shattering the fragile form. The clone dissipated into nothingness with that effort. Immediately that happened, Northern felt a completion. It was more. The muscle memory from the clone's abrupt movement, he could feel it being seared into his own. His muscles felt sore, just like it would have if he was the one making those wild movements. With his clone gone, Northern stood alone, still bound by the chains as two different voices entered his ear, one after the other. Less than you have killed a disaster Hellion monster, Phrygian walker greater than. Less than you have received an item greater than. Less than item will be ingrained in your soul greater than. You have slain a hazard Hellion, Phrygian walker. You have gained +4 talent fragments. Tears welled up in Northern's eyes as he rose to his feet, his body battered and bruised. They were tears of happiness, so much happiness spinned and spiraled inside of him. He didn't actually think he was going to make it. But he did, he defeated a Hellion rank monster. Even if it was wounded, it was a lot of achievement. He was a walker with limited combat experience, trapped by chains. And somehow, he had managed to kill a Hellion rank monster. Not even before this feat had been recorded. No one would expect that a walker would have the guts to kill a Hellion rank. It was unbelievable. Northern exhaustively panted as he tried to rest from the soreness of his muscles. Since the clone had returned to him, he had to shoulder both its gains and its losses. He finally steadied his breath and gripped tighter the sword in his hands, ready to continue his journey. However, as he turned, an incarnate of darkness was standing a stone throw away from him, 4 red eyes glowing with a vicious, flesh-cutting bloodlust. Chapter 36. Something is about to change. Northern's expression crumpled as it was immediately overwhelmed by dread. Fear crawled across his skins with cold tips, his body shook uncontrollably. What? Thinking straight at this moment was impossible. His nemesis was here again. Why? Why now? Why again? Just when he thought he had finally grasped victory by its helm and was going to lead his way out of this hellish realm. It came again. What in the world is this nonsense? Who wanted him dead so badly that would go to any extent to see their dreams come to fruition? Was it the gods? Was it Ruffsburg? Damn it, who should he haunt after he dies? Huh. At Nobleman At once Northern's face became grim, void of any fears or emotion for a second. You just thought about death, didn't you? He internally said to himself. He tilted his head with a dangerous glimmer in his blue eyes. Don't do that. We are not going to die here. We are survivalist. Thud. A heavy pressure, almost palpable, crumbled on Northern's vicinity, making the shadows surrounding the lower level of trees shrink back as fast as they could. The night terror took a pause, its tetrad eyes narrowing at once. Northern, like a living dead, bent over to pick the decrepit scimitar and aimed it forward, lackadaisical to the chains bounding his hands and legs. I don't care. I'm just going to burst through you whatever way. His eyes were fueled with a maddening rage and determination that made his expression starkly dark, like a seed of absolute darkness that would stop at nothing to exert its vengeance upon its foes. The terror was about to take another step but immediately jumped back 2 steps away from Northern. For a moment, a walker who had only succeeded in killing a Hellion rank monster thanks to his clone, achieved something that only masters should be able to. The terror's expression became furious, snarling with a primal instinct to kill whatever posed an unreasonable amount of threat to it. It didn't even look this serious while facing the Phrygian walker. However, that was all there was to it. It was just that one moment. Before Northern's eyes could pick anything, the terror lunged forward with a blinding speed. Its clawed hand grasped the survivalist face and slammed it to the ground before he could react. Fast. That was the only thing Northern's mind could do. A fraction of a second before the hand touched his face and sent a slight crack through the ground. A jolt of headache viciously shot through his head, blood splattering out from his mouth as he wailed. It was a miracle he was even conscious. He tried to stand up, but the night terror held him down for a few seconds and looked around. The lifeless body of the general it pursued was sprawled across the ground not far from Northern. With an inquisitive gaze, it looked at the dead monster and looked at Northern, who was still struggling to stand up. The monster tilted its head in conundrum. It lingered a few seconds before releasing its hand from Northern's head. The latter shot up as fast as he could and scuttled back, staggering. The terror, however, did not seem to be in for the chase this time around. Northern frowned slightly. What is this? Night terror was standing in front of him with a blank expression on its monstrous face. It was doing nothing. No, if Northern wanted to guess what its expression was. It looks confused. That was right, the night terror looked like it was very conflicted about something. Northern's frown deepened. Should I try running away? He lingered for a few seconds, observing the unresponsive monster. No, that would be suicidal. Maybe something is really wrong. Northern decided to not be reckless this time and trust his intuition. And that sharp-edged mind of his was telling him to silently stay and do nothing. Slowly, trying not to alert the terror unnecessarily, Northern lowered his legs and dropped the decrepit blade, although he tried to do it softly but couldn't totally kill the metallic ring of the rundown blade. The night terror stared a little bit more intense than before for a few seconds before it looked back at the corpse of the monster. It seemed to shrug as it started to walk forward. At this point, Northern was desperately hoping he had made the right call. He'd never forgive himself if his head flew off before he got the chance to defend himself. Not that it was going to mean much anyway. If the night terror was dead bent on killing him, he doubted if anything would be able to stop it. The monster got to his front. Northern's legs were shaking. The monster bent and picked up his blade, then walked away. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over Northern's heart. It was like he drank a cold water after being in the sun for an entire day. He watched the monster as it took prideful stride to the corpse of the Phrygian walker, then in a flash, swung the sword and separated the head of the monster from its body. Then it walked back to Northern. This time, Northern was not shaking like before. He could tell at this point that this abhorrent creature was not going to kill him. The monster stood in front of him, arrogantly grabbed the links of his chain right in the middle and hurled him after him as it began to move. Northern's steps floundered, but he managed to keep up, staring at the monster's back with a vehement passion for vengeance. I swear, even if it will be the last thing I do, my soul will see no rest until I end you with my own two hands. Northern vowed as the night terror hauled him away to the kingdom of Red Mine, for the second time. This time, however, his circumstances were different. He was conscious. Maybe it was a good thing or a bad thing. Northern couldn't tell, but he was sure something was about to change. Chapter 37 Lord of the Castle. Perhaps because he could see it from afar. Before, when they were led to the battlefield, he couldn't get a good glimpse of the kingdom of Red Mine because it sprawled right behind him. It was a magnificent sight, yet crude in a disturbing way. The kingdom of Red Mine was like a scar upon the earth, its towering red mountains stretching endlessly into the horizon under the perpetual shroud of the gray, starless sky. The land itself bore the hue of dried blood, as if a rain of blood had endlessly plagued the land at some point in the past. Situated at the edge of this foreboding domain loomed a grim fortress. It was the first point of entry before heading towards the Red Mine, which was weird, considering that most kingdom castles were always centered in the middle of the kingdom. But the castle of Red Mine sat at the edge of the kingdom. Its weathered stone walls rose defiantly from the rugged terrain, bearing the scars of centuries past. Deep cracks marred the surface, testifying to the relentless passage of time, while the once grand towers now stood as crumbling sentinels, their spires reaching towards the oppressive sky. Rust consumed the metal doors that guarded its entrance, their once shining surfaces now tarnished and corroded. Northern's eyes glided up as the monster stopped in front of the large, rusting gate. Even in its dilapidated state, the massive worn-out metal remained a grim barrier against intrusion, a warning to any who would dare to challenge the kingdom's dominion. Northern gulped as the door let out a creaking growl while it slowly slid open. Inside the castle, as expected, several cacophonies of monsters stood vigilant, their forms a grotesque amalgamation of nightmare and reality. Some possessed bipedal legs like night terror, their movements eerily reminiscent of predatory beasts stalking their prey. Others took on a more humanoid guise, their twisted features warped by dark influence. Four eyes gleamed with feral intelligence, while ears twitched with heightened senses as Northern and the Night Terror walked slowly into the castle. Northern carefully observed, his heart pounding so loudly that he worried they would hear. Every step felt like he was walking down the path of destruction, creatures of vile brutality keenly staring at him from both sides. For reasons unknown, none of them dared to stop Night Terror or get in his way. They entered the main chamber, walked down the dark aisle that led to the inner chamber, the throne room. Entering through the towering doors, heavy with age and adorned with intricate but faded carvings depicting scenes of conquest and domination, Northern and the Night Terror were met with a chilling tableau of opulent decay. The room itself was cavernous, with high ceilings that seemed to vanish into the shadows above. Tattered banners hung limply from the rafters, their once proud symbols now faded and frayed with time. The walls were lined with cracked tapestries, their vibrant colors muted by years of neglect, depicting scenes of battle and conquest that now seemed like distant memories. Looking around, Northern couldn't help but be intimidated by a sense of dark supremacy, but that was nothing compared to the way his heart seemed to seize the moment he turned his head to the shadows that shrouded the distant end of the room. Something was there, but he could not see it. Suddenly, the prideful, powerful, and dangerous monster that Northern had thought reigned supreme over the kingdom of Red Mine slammed both knees to the ground and bowed completely facing the end of the room. A powerful pressure fell over him, intangibly shrouding him like an impregnable dark veil. At the far end of the room, atop a dais of crumbling stone, sat the throne of Red Mine. Carved from dark, ancient wood and adorned with twisted symbols of power, the throne loomed like a sinister specter against the backdrop of the chamber. Behind it, a tattered banner hung, bearing the sigil of the kingdom, a blood-red emblem that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Ad nobleman at. Seated upon the throne was the ruler of Red Mine, a figure cloaked in shadow and draped in tattered robes of darkest black. Its features were obscured by the darkness, leaving only the malevolent red gleam of its eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. Immediately, Northern tried to meet its gaze, but he cowered back, shrinking with chills as he felt the weight of those eyes upon him, a silent judgment that left him trembling in fear. The Night Terror stood up and walked closer to the throne, stopping in front of the crumbled stairs. It flung the head of the Phrygian walker and pointed back to the human bowing at the center of the room. Northern tried to steal a glance to understand what was happening, but his fear was too magnanimous to give leeway. He silently stayed, head bowed, kissing the ground and trying not to sniff at the pungent scent, like the tang of iron mingled with the musty aroma of ancient stone, underlined by a faint earthy smell. A couple of minutes later, the Night Terror reached in front of the human. With those vicious talons, it lifted Northern up by his hair, surprisingly gently. Northern stood up, and the terrific monster took several steps back and lowered its head respectfully. At first, Northern thought the Night Terror was bowing to him. He was quickly consumed by so much disgust that he wanted to puke, but he didn't get to conceive any thoughts before his notion was corrected. The encroaching darkness at the end of the room slowly seemed to draw nearer, pulling with it an immense cloud of horror that crept on the floor eerily. Northern gulped and was about to take a step back but was frozen in place. He quickly lowered his head before the being, fear cutting across his heart like a blade sharpened over 100 years. Still in front of him, Northern couldn't get a full grasp of what this creature was. It's powerful. Very powerful. Drops of sweat formed over his lowered face. He really tried to figure it out, what this abomination that was standing in front of him was, but his neck was stiff, he couldn't raise his head. Everything was just so heavy on him. Then the creature stretched forth something to him. For the first time, Northern felt slight ease as he moved his head. Although it was not enough to look up into the eyes of the creature. However, he could clearly see the blade that was being pointed at him. It was a long sword. Its blade was pitch black, looking like it had been smelted from an onyx stone, but upon a deeper look at it, Northern could see red lines running across the black steel-like veins. He didn't need to think too far. An idea of the origin of those lines occurred to him immediately he saw them. The red crystal. It was possible that the sword was forged using the red crystal as a raw ingredient. Those were the notable things about the sword, others were quite mundane. Its pommel was not too long, and the cross guard was just a slight arc upward, then slight carvings were engraved on both the pommel and hilt. It was a long steel blade that looked very amazing, and yet this creature was offering it to him. Why? Northern wondered. Chapter 38 Rank Up. Northern didn't want to delay receiving a gift from an embodiment of darkness like this for too long. With trembling hands, he outstretched his pale limbs and received the sword. Then, without a word, the creature returned to where it was originally seated. Northern could swear he didn't catch a glimpse of it moving. In fact, it looked like it had been seated there the whole time. But Northern was sure the creature had come towards him. The sword was still in his hand, and his pores were widened, hair standing on end in alert. Belatedly, as he looked at his hand, he noticed. A slight frown appeared on his face. When the chains that bound his legs and hands had dissolved into black sand. Northern had no idea when this had happened. He was very sure the creature didn't come into contact with him in any way. Northern felt a little ache in his brows as he furrowed them, looking at his free hand and the tenebrous longsword in his hands. Then something happened. Less than you have accomplished something greater than. Less than you are on the road to discovery greater than. Less than you have received an attribute. Formless, greater than. Less than you have received a superior rank item greater than. Less than item shall be attuned to your soul greater than. Northern was sure he didn't hear wrong. The item received from the monster became attuned to his soul. If I remember well, I also received an item from killing that damned Phrygian monster. The Night Terror walked forward, gesturing for Northern to follow with a flip of its grotesque hand. Northern instinctively went after it. Anything to get out of this place. It was just a thought that came across his mind as he walked out of the threatening room and stole a last glance at the ruler seated indifferently in the middle of it. If by chance, the guardian of this rift is that thing, and I have to defeat it before being able to leave this rift, Northern shook his head pitifully at himself. He tried to broaden his vision and dream really far. But defeating that thing, he felt like he was deluding himself. That thing, he was sure, was not a Hellion rank, and most importantly, if that monster was higher than a Hellion rank, then that meant he was not in a Tier E rift but a Tier IV. Now that was an even more demoralizing realization. A walker in a Tier IV rift. Really? Who did I offend to deserve such a cruel fate? He almost bit his tongue as he smacked his teeth while walking. He looked at the back of the Night Terror. Still, things are kind of progressing, I guess. I am walking right now, behind a monster I hate so much, I want to stab him from the back and gut the hell out of him. But that'll probably be the most stupid thing I've done. At Novelban at. He exhaled through his mouth, subtly releasing the air of anger that boiled within him. I can't be that stupid. I'm a survivalist. I need to think the way a survivalist would. First was understanding. Obviously, there was a reason why he was brought back to this place unharmed by none other than the Night Terror itself. They were monsters, and he couldn't understand them, but he could read their actions and give slight meaning to things. His guess was that Night Terror here had seen him kill the Phrygian walker, which was the general of their foe, as simple. Minded monsters, they must have thought he was a slave that survived and even pursued the general to kill him. No, Night Terror isn't that dumb. He could have suspected that I was trying to run away. Northern squinted his eyes. The chains. His eyes widened with a radiant sparkle. It was all luck. No doubt about it. It's very possible that Night Terror didn't suspect him of trying to escape because of the chains. And he had even killed the enemy's general. Even if a human kingdom was at play here, that was enough for Northern to become a free man. But Northern doubted if there was ever such a thing in this place. The likely explanation was that he had risen in rank. He lowered his eyes at the tenebrous blade. This was proof that he was personally favored by the lord of the castle. Even Night Terror seemed to be glancing back with a slight show of envy on its hideous face. Ah damn. I feel so stressed right now. Finally, they reached a wooden door. Creaking it open, both of them walked down the stairs. A dark alley of rooms sprawled out before Northern's face, carrying a pungent, swampy smell that made him pinch his nose. The Night Terror continued forward indifferently and stopped in front of a room, pointing to it and looking at Northern with four malicious glares, no matter how casual it tried to appear. Northern nodded, opened the door, and hesitantly entered. The Night Terror stayed there until he had fully entered his chamber before walking away. Northern looked around. He didn't know whether to call this a rank up or rank down. At last, he wasn't being guarded by anyone and had a room to himself. Even though darkness made up most of its parts, there were no windows and ventilation. It was underground, and everywhere felt hot. Northern could make out a small mattress against the wall by carefully tracing his way through the darkness. There was a small table and something on the table. For now, Northern didn't know what it was, but it was shaped like a small wooden bowl. He sat on the mattress and crossed his legs, closing his eyes for a few minutes. The grumbling of his stomach made him open his eyes. He placed his hand on the hungry stomach. Come to think of it, I don't think I've eaten in a very long time. It wasn't like food was going to come by wishing for it. Since his standard of living had changed, he was sure feeding in this place would be better. Hence, he was just going to focus on the things he could do for now. A smile carved out of his statuesque face. Now, let me see the item I received. Chapter 39 Rise of the Puissant Sentinel. Profile. Name. Northern Longguard. True name. Not yet received. Attributes. Formless, at nobleman at. Soul rank. Walker. Talent fragments. 666 1,000ths. Owned talents 1/1. Owned items Mortal Blade, Eternal Twilight. There they are. A new tab appeared in front of Northern's eyes and he inquisitively inspected his new set of items. Name. Mortal Blade. Type. Weapon. Rank. Superior. Order. 2. Description. Blinded by his greed for supreme power, the insane monarch laid waste to his entire kingdom, making of it nothing but an ocean of blood. Weapon abilities. Blood Reaver, Last Blood. Blood Reaver. Mortal Blade will absorb blood from its target to heal the wounds of its wielder. However, the blood must be crimson. Last Blood. When the wielder is at the point of death, Mortal Blade might exchange the blood state of its wielder for that of its target. However, a hit must be made before this ability can be activated. Northern covered his gaping mouth. He didn't know if he should cry or laugh. But a big wide grin spread across his face a second later. Yes. He smothered his scream, letting it out as a whisper so as not to cause unnecessary disturbance. The blade he received from the lord of the castle undoubtedly was amazing. Besides, it was of the superior rank. Powers of weapons were measured using a ranking process. For rifts it was tier, for talents it was class, for attributes it was a ranking system, and for soul, it was ranking 2. Weapons, soul and talents were automatically decided by Ul'Tra-el. The one for rifts were put together by experts from ancient days after careful introspection. Along the line Ul'Tra-el naturally adopted it too. Even though weapons, attributes and soul used ranking systems, their ranking were vastly different. Weapons from low to high ranking were normal greater than superior greater than enchanted greater than arcane greater than lordly greater than heroic greater than legendary greater than ancient greater than divine greater than abysmal greater than fated. While attributes ranking were ordinary greater than unique greater than mystic greater than divine greater than abysmal greater than fated. And for talents it was F greater than E greater than D greater than C greater than B greater than A greater than S greater than SS greater than SSS greater than X. All this ranks come together were what built the formidability of a drifter. Of course, weapons still had what was called order, which was totally dependent on the origin of the weapon and outlined the amount of abilities they possessed. For example, a weapon of order I would possess only 1 ability while a weapon of order V would possess 6 abilities. Northern fisted his hand. This was a jackpot. Getting an order 2 superior weapon from a monster was an impossible feat. But he still had something else to see. He dismissed the panel in front of him, summoning the next one. Name. Eternal Twilight. Type. Armor. Rank. Enchanted. Order. I. Description. The Twilight usually donned this armor with pride. Oh, how joyful he looked when he marched to war at the dawn of the day and rode back on the helm of victory at dusk. What is left of it now is corruption and carnage. Weapon ability. Mistwalker. Mistwalker. The white and brown leather armor releases thin wisps of fog and dust from its seams. You can teleport to areas within the fog. Once this ability has been used, it can't be used again until dawn. Northern couldn't help but grin again. It couldn't have gotten better. Gaining an enchanted weapon was unbelievable, but then it was an Hellion rank monster that he miraculously managed to defeat. Both items were amazing. Mortal Blade seemed more interesting, but Eternal Twilight was great too. However, a second later Northern's expression became sullen. That was because there was a fatal flaw. Since he was just a walker, the only effect his soul essence served was to use his talent ability. Wait. Northern paused his thought process. That should only apply to walkers who actually have a soul core, right? A smile parted his lips. This could work. He squinted his eyes, and summoned the Eternal Twilight. Thousands of ethereal strings silently squirmed around his body, weaving into each other. In a couple of seconds, his body shone through the pitch darkness, shrouding the place in a second of illumination. As the light dimmed, a white cloth and leather armor artistically shrouded his frame. A flowing cloak of the dirty white billowed behind him, its silken fabric contrasting with the rest of his hardened garb. Intricate armor of hardened brown leather encompassed his body, each section seamlessly integrated together into a formidable raiment. The breastplate had been carefully molded into an athletic form, with angular contours following the lines of Northern's lean physique, as they would have matched to any others. Sturdy pauldrons of articulated leather reinforced the spalders on either side, permitting a full range of muscular motion. A pair of sleek gauntlets sheathed Northern's forearms with muted brown leather, steel studs glinting between flexible bands that shifted with each flex of the fingers. The smooth greaves betrayed no weaknesses in their construction, protecting his legs with their unmarred fa. Up to mid-thigh. In a moment, Northern had transformed into a puissant sentinel armored in a dichotomy of ethereal grace and uncompromising resilience against darkness. He looked splendidly different from the scrawny, shirtless slave he was a second ago. Even though his cheeks were still bony and eyes deeper in their socket than they should be, Northern still exuded the aura of a reliable warrior. He moved his hand around. It's easy to move around. I don't feel any restraint at all. He stood from his bed and took 3-5 steps. It was the most he could go in this small corner of his. Knock knock. Northern heard the knock on the door as he continued to admire himself. With a tentative gesture, he opened the door. In front of his room was standing a horrific creature with burnt face. Northern looked down to avoid seeing any more of its disturbing face. A wooden tray with 2 separate plates held together by its austere claws. Northern collected the tray and politely walked away. After the monster moved away from his door, he closed it with his legs and managed to drop the tray on the table, but the bowl that was there before was shifted and fell on the ground, disturbing the serene darkness with a loud clatter. Northern picked it up and brought it closer. This close was enough for him to make out what it was. A lamp. If it was a lamp, then that meant there was a way to light it. Northern knocked his door and opened it a second later. As expected, a random monster that was guarding the entrance of the hallway was already making its way down to him indifferently. Northern stretched the wooden bowl lamp to it. The monster walked away after receiving the lamp and came back a second later with a blue flame dancing on the edge of the lamp. Smiling heartily, Northern collected the lamp and placed it at the center of the room. He was able to see a bit clearly now that there was light. The room was a small compartment with just his bed and a small table. He opened the lid of the plates that sat on the table. The aroma that rolled into his nose was neither pleasant nor was it unpleasant. Besides, the food looked edible. It was a brown watery, perhaps soup, soon leaf and meat in it. The next plate contained a clear transparent liquid. Water. Northern's eyes lit up. Have I even tasted water since coming to this rift? Northern gulped half of the liquid before turning to the food. He gulped and stared with lines of hesitations drawn on his face. After lingering for a couple of seconds more, he took the bowl and drank the liquid. As compared to what he feared, it was actually tasty, spicy but great compared to the disgust he had been feeding on before. Not to say the meat was well cooked and very succulent. Just as Northern was done eating, a knock sounded on his door. Looking up inquisitively, Northern went to fetch the door. As he saw who stood before him, his face became stern. Chapter 40 War General. Northern. Northern stood before his grotesque angel of death. The monster, as usual, maintained a feral indifference. Whether he was a slave or no longer one, it did not seem to care. At Nobleman at. Even the night terror. In fact, Northern couldn't tell if the monster remembered knocking him out and kidnapping him. But he suspected it did. Something then happened that made Northern's eyes widen. The grotesque monster lowered its head and took a step back as Northern attempted to walk. Northern paused, a confused frown etched on his face. What is this? The monster that he suspected might be of Hellion rank was bowing to him. Cautiously, Northern made his way through the door, still looking with unbelieving eyes. As he walked forward, the monster followed behind him, but Northern had glanced back more than 10 times before they reached halfway to the entrance of the dark alley. He stopped, turned to the monster with a dark frown. He pointed at it and then forward. How about you walk in front and I'll walk behind you? He instructed with a furrowed brow. The monster, without unnecessary movements, put one leg after the other and ventured forward. Raising his brows, Northern mused internally. Interesting, they understand well. It wasn't far-fetched considering there was a slight spark of intelligence in the way they looked. They went forward, and after a couple of minutes, they reached the surface, and after a few more treks, they emerged at the yard of the castle. There were several hideous creatures, most with bipedal legs and black fur, almost resembling the night terror but far inferior in size and aura of destructibility. They did not make him cower in the least. They were all sparsely gathered in the open sandy area, with a slightly elevated platform standing in the middle. As they reached, his angel of death bowed again and stopped walking. Noticing his arrival, the other monsters, a little over 100 of them, turned and bowed their heads in the same manner, parting to carve out a path to the platform for the human standing before them. Northern, appalled, did not know what to make of this situation. I figured since the lord of the castle gave me a sword, I would be some sort of warrior. But are they straight up making me a general? Northern stood for a couple of seconds, stunned by surprise. After recollecting himself, he cautiously walked to the podium and climbed. Immediately he did, all the monsters below him went on their knees. The atmosphere became tense, as if they were waiting for something. Northern was not sure how to communicate with monsters, so he raised his sword in the air and let out a wild, feral cry, the best his hoarse voice could muster. Surprisingly, the horde of monsters returned his yell with an even wilder outburst, their cries shooting high into the sky, threatening to split it apart. Northern felt his heart tremble, a faint smile making its way to his face. He didn't know if it was a rush of excitement or a momentary fear from how heavy and thunderous their shout was. But either way, it seemed his attempt had miraculously worked. The monsters glared at him with their primal eyes gleaming with a terrifying amount of hope. It wasn't a spark, it was a tremendous flame of trust placed in the one that stood before them, that was what their eyes reflected. Northern collected himself and looked down with a slight show of surprise. Did I really just become a war general? It seemed that was the case. He had gone ahead and become a war general to a bunch of monsters. The corner of his lips curled awkwardly. Damn, I don't know whether to be excited or to be scared, he muttered to himself. He slowly climbed down the platform, and when he walked out of his horde of monsters, the night terror was already waiting for him. The monster gave him a long glance before stretching something toward him. Northern's face crumpled into a scowl. This bastard, he remembers after all. In that split second of scowling at the night terror, Northern was not sure, or was he? He could have seen the monster smirk, or he could have been imagining it. He collected his cross-bottomless bag regardless and stared at the monster with no particular emotion. But the night terror was still standing in front of him with a deadpan expression. Northern returned the stare for a couple more seconds, but it soon grew awkward. He was about to leave when another monster came into the yard with a clinking chain, at the lower end of which a white-furred, purple-growled pup vexatiously. But the monster holding the chain did not seem to care, as if the fangled critter was merely threatening to bite. Northern's eyes became round. Mr. Fluffy. The vexed pup suddenly paused its arrogant snarls at the monster and threw its head forward. Its eyes lit up with sparkles the next second, its tailless backside dancing left and right. The night terror gestured toward the monster with a hand wave. The latter crouched and removed the shackles from the critter's neck. Even as the monster tried to free it, Mr. Fluffy snarled desperately at it, teeth still sharp and white as needles. Consistently throwing its head toward Northern, anxiously waiting to run to him. As the chains fell, it sprawled into motion, falling and rising from its short legs as it reached Northern, circling him and kissing his boots. Northern chuckled lightly as he watched the little mutt. Would you look at this guy? I doubt we even knew each other for an hour and he's already fond of me. He raised his head back at the night terror, who was now walking away from the yard. It stopped and turned, then gave Northern an intense gaze that chilled his blood. Just as the night terror was about to step into the entrance, a deafening horn resounded through the sky of the castle. Northern's face was contorted by strong horror. I recognize that sound. Only now, it sounded closer than before. When it had sounded last time, the prison mine had opened, and they were taken to the battlefield to die as meat shields. For one, Northern was not a slave again, so he wouldn't die as a meat shield. However, he was now in an even direr situation than the last. He is a general. There's no mistaking it, that horn was a call to war. Northern was sure about that part. However, if it really is what he suspected it to be, that means he'd be marching to war very soon. Northern looked at the night terror, who gave him a sidelong glance before walking into the darkness of the chamber beyond. Crap, 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 that bastard looks like he's enjoying something. Crap once again.